Howdy doody, ladies and gentlemen. Fuck Kaiser Permanente. We're gonna kill all of them. Whoa! That's a lot of bitches. Fuck you, Kaiser! Awesome. Fuck you, Kaiser. Skittles would have never let this happen. This is not going to be easy. I like how quick the load times are, thank goodness. Alright, let's get out of here and run away. Shit. Sweet, got him. Good for them. Fuck Kaiser Permanente, fuck Kaiser Permanente, fuck Kaiser Permanente, fuck Kaiser Permanente. Ooh, I got a blue key? Where's my special cream? There we go. Woke up, fell out of bed. I grab a comb across my head. Found my way upstairs and had a smoke. Somebody spoke and I went into a dream. Look all around, nothing but blue skies. Ba ba da 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 da. Bitches! Who the fuck do you think you are?
Fuck yourself!
Right.
Go fuck yourself!
Do you know who I am? Leroy Pappa! Don't kill me. I walked right into it. Go! Hate those things. Oh! Oh, I'm invisible now. Don't kill me. That's how Pappa plays this game. Fast! Ryan! Shit! I'm playing Doom! Nice! I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I could do that. I can throw my axe? Shit! Run, Pappa!
Alarm set allowed for the 23rd. The next reminder will be the 3rd alarm at 7 a.m.
What the fuck? Shitheads! Nice try, fuckheads. Do you know who I am? I have 2 guns. Shit. Get out of here. Yeah! Process. Okay. We're gonna look something up real quick. Fuck. Why is my life like this? Ugh. Ugh. I can set color? Okay. I don't know what SDR video means. I don't know what this stuff means. Okay. Look how sharp I am. I don't even know what any of this stuff means. Wesley! Oh, what have I done? You can see, I've done something. Okay, let's get rid of all of these. Now I see what it is. Yes, get rid of all of this stuff. I don't want any of it. I want none of it. None of it. There we go. Okay. Ugh.
No, not that. But I mean, like,
That'll
if we
work.
discover life, we discovered interesting new physical phenomena. I think the right approach is definitely to be extremely skeptical.
Okay.
And be very, very careful about things you want to be true. That's
Yeah,
really
I would say
admirable.
I'm not like some extreme denialist of evidence. If there was compelling evidence for life on another planet, I would be the first one to be celebrating
is-
that and be shaking hands with the alien on the White House lawn, whatever. That would be, I grew up with Star Trek, and that was my fantasy, was to be Captain Kirk and fly
After you
across
get
the
the
stars
Berserk
being a
pack and
civilization.
gain
So
super strength,
there's
you can
nothing more I'd
perform
want to be
third-person
true, as I said,
executions
but,
like in Doom comics.
we
Rip and tear
we
more, or
just
just
have
give
to guard
enemies
against
away.
it when
Smash
we're
mode. I don't know what that
assessing
means.
But I
definitive-
have to say I'm very skeptical that we will ever have that Star Trek moment. even if there are other civilizations out there, they're never going to be at a point.
The regular
which is in
attacks
technological
allows it to be
lockstep with
thrown
us,
at an enemy.
similar level of development. Even
Well, the alt fire drops
intellectually,
the
the idea
barrel
that
to
they
set it as a
could,
trap. Also using the
have a
berserk pack, you
conversation
can
with
pick
us,
up
even through a
stunned former
translator.
humans and imps.
I mean, we can't
Nice.
communicate with humpback whales. We can't communicate with dolphins in a meaningful way. We can sort of bark orders at them, but we can't have abstract conversations with them about things.
I don't know what gib
And
means.
so
Why would anybody
the
know what
idea that
gib
we will
means?
ever have that fulfilling.
Has anybody heard of a
conversation,
gib?
I'm deeply skeptical of, and I think a lot of us are drawn.
Just
to
tell
that. It
me
is
the
maybe a
answer.
replacement for God to some degree, that father figure civilization that might step in, teach us the error of our ways, and bestow wisdom upon our civilization. But they could equally be a giant fungus that doesn't even understand the idea of socialization, because it's the only entity on its planet. It just swells over the entire surface, and it's incredibly intelligent because maybe each node communicates with each other to create essentially a giant neural net. But it has no sense of what communication even is.
Pick up lassos and barrels and throw them. When a berserk pack is collected, barrels can be picked up by alt firing with the fists.
That fantasy moment I
The
always had as
regular
a kid
attack
of
allows it to be
having a
thrown at an
dialogue
enemy.
with another civilization.
So
While the alt
dialogue,
fire
yes. What about noticing them? What about noticing signals?
Drops
Do
the
you
barrel
hope-
to set it as a
So
trap.
one thing we've been
Also
talking
using the
about is
berserk
getting
pack, you can pick up
signatures,
stunned former
biosignatures,
humans and
technosignatures
imps.
about other
A stun
planets.
monster
Maybe
will have had its arm or
if we're
leg blown
extremely
off
lucky in our
and be
lifetime to
kneeling
be
on the
able to
ground
meet
to use it as meat
life
shields
forms,
against projectiles. This restricts the
get
player to
evidence
the assault
of
rifle.
living or dead
But
life
the
forms
meat
on Mars
shield can be
or
thrown
the
for extra
moons,
damage at
Jupiter,
any
and Saturn.
time. A kick
What about
attack
getting
has been
signals
added to
from outer
push enemies
space,
away from the
interstellar
player,
signals?
similar to Duke Nukem 3D.
What kind
It
of
can be
what
bound
will those
to a
signals
specific
potentially
key.
look like?
If you jump before kicking,
That's a hard question to answer because
you'll
we are
perform a flying
essentially
kick.
engaged
Nice,
in
which deals 3
xenopsychology
times
to
more
some degree.
damage.
What
But
are
this
the
movement usually
activities
turns
of another
you
civilization?
very vulnerable. You
A
have
lot
the
of that
ability to flip
is
What does the word
monsters off by a
xenopsychology,
bindable
apologies to
command known
interrupt,
as a
mean?
fend. This command
Well,
will
maybe
alert
I'm
nearby
just
monsters
fabricating that
as if
word
the
really,
player
but
had just
it's
fired a
it's
weapon.
trying to guess
You
at
have the ability to
the
wave a bindable
machinations
command known
and
as wave,
motivations
pressing the
of
wave button
another
during a
intelligent
fatality.
being that
See,
was
will allow the player to
completely
see his own
evolutionary divorced
wave
from us.
animation in
So it's
third
like-
person,
like you
okay?
said, exo
Punching a
means
zombie man, shotgun
exopsychology,
guy, shame gunner, or
Yeah,
imp from
psychology.
behind before the
alien
enemy
psychology is another way of
has
maybe
noticed.
making it more grounded. But
the player will cause the marine to snap the enemy's neck, killing
we
the
can't
enemy
really
instantly
guess
without
at
alerting
their
the
motivations
Nice.
too well, but we can look at the sorts of behaviors we
Sprite
engage in
change of
and
rockets
at
and
least look
box
for
of
them.
rockets, blah, 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 blah.
We're always
I'll look
guilty
at this
that when we
later.
look for biosignatures, we're really looking for, and even when we look for planets, we're looking for templates of Earth. When we look for biosignatures, we're looking for templates of Earth-based life. When we look for technosignatures, we tend to be looking for
Okay.
templates of our own behaviors or extrapolations of our behaviors. There's a very long list of technosignatures that people have suggested we could look for. The earliest ones were, of course, radio beacons. That was sort of Project Ozma that Frank Drake was involved in, trying to look for radio signatures, which could either be just like blurting out.
All right, here we go.
high-power
We're learning
radio
how to
signals
do
saying,
stuff,
"Hey, we're
everybody.
here,"
Fuck Kaiser.
Or could even have encoded within
Leroy
them galactic
Pappa!
encyclopedias for us to unlock, which has always been the allure of the radio technique. But there could also be unintentional signatures. For example, you can have something like the satellite system that we've produced around the Earth, the artificial satellite system, Starlink type systems we mentioned. You could detect the glint of light across those satellites as they orbit around the planet. You could detect a geostationary satellite belt, which would block out sunlight as the planet transited across the star. You could detect solar panels, potentially spectrally, on the surface of the planet. Heat island effect. New York is hotter than New York State by a couple of degrees because of the heat island effect of the city, and so you could thermally map different planets and detect these. So there's a large array of things that we do that we can go out and hypothesize
Nice.
we could look for. And then on the furthest end of the scale, you have things which go far beyond our capabilities, such as warp drive signatures, which have been proposed. You get these bright flashes of light, or even gravitational wave detections from LIGO could be detected. You could have Dyson spheres, the idea of covering basically a star is completely covered by some kind of structure which collects all the light from the star to power the civilization, and that would be pretty easily detectable to some degree because you're transferring all of the visible light. Thermodynamically, it has to be re-emitted, so it would come out as infrared light. You have an incredibly bright infrared star, yet one that was visibly not present at all, and so there would be pretty intriguing signature to look for.
But is there efforts to look for something like that for Dyson spheres out there?
There has been, yeah, there has been, and there's been, I think in the literature there was one with the IRAS satellite, which is a satellite. They targeted, I think, more than 100,000 nearby stars and found no convincing examples of what looked like a Dyson sphere star. And then Jason Wright and his team extended this, I think, using WISE, which is another infrared satellite, to look around galaxies. So could an entire galaxy have been converted into Dyson spheres, or a significant fraction of the galaxy, which is basically the Kardashev Type 3, right? This is when you've basically mastered the entire galactic pool of resources. And again, out of 100,000 nearby galaxies, there appears to be no compelling examples of what looks like a Dyson galaxy, if you want to call it that. So that by no means proves that they don't exist or don't happen, but it seems like it's an unusual behavior for a civilization to get to that stage of development and start harvesting the entire stellar output.
Unusual, yes. I mean, LIGO is super interesting with gravitational waves.
I revealed a
that
secret.
kind of experiment could start seeing some weirdness, some weird signals.
But why?
Some that compare to the power of cosmic phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole new window to the universe, not just in terms of astrophysics, but potentially for technosignatures as well. I have to say, with the warp drives, I am skeptical that warp drives are possible, because you have kind of a fundamental problem where you either travel or causality. You can only choose two of those three things. You really can't have
your
a
legs.
coherent universe. If you have all three, you basically end up with the possibility of these kind of temporal paradoxes and time loops and grandfather paradoxes.
Well, can't there be pockets of causality, something like that? Like where there's like pockets of consistent causality.
You could design it in that way. You could be, if you had a warp drive or a time machine, essentially, you could be you can be very conscious and careful of the way you use it, so as to not to cause paradoxes or just do it in a local area or something. But the real fundamental problem is you always have the ability to do it. And so in a vast cosmic universe, if time machines are all over the place, there's too much risk of someone doing it, right? Of somebody having the option of essentially breaking the universe with this. So there's a fundamental problem. Hawking has this chronology protection conjecture where he said that essentially this just can't be allowed, because it breaks all our laws of physics if time travel is possible.
Current laws of physics, yes.
Correct, yeah. And so we'd need to rip up relativity. I mean, that's the point, is the current laws of physics. So you'd have to rip up our current law of relativity to make sense of how FTL could live in that universe, because you can't have relativity, FTL, and causality sit nicely and play nicely together.
But we currently don't have quantum mechanics and relativity playing nice together anyway, so it's not
Correct.
like everything
Yeah.
is all a nice little fabric.
It's certainly not the full picture. There must be more to go.
Yeah.
But
So it's already ripped up, so might as well rip it up a little more. And then, and in the process, actually try to connect the two things, because maybe in the unification of the standard model and general relativity, maybe there lies some kind of new wisdom about warp drives. So by the way, warp drives is somehow messing with the fabric of the universe to be able to travel faster than the speed of light.
yeah,
Is that warp drives?
you're basically bending space-time. You could also do it with a wormhole or some of the hypothetical FTL systems. It doesn't have to necessarily be the Alcubierre drive, the warp drive. It could be any faster than light system. As long as it travels superluminally, it will violate causality.
And presumably that will be observable with LIGO.
Potentially. Depends on, I think, the properties of whatever the spacecraft is. I mean, one problem with warp drives is there's all sorts of problems with warp drives, but when
Like the start of that sentence. One problem.
yeah,
Warp drive.
there's just this one minor problem that we have to get around. But when it arrives at its destination, it basically collects this vast. It has like an event horizon almost at the front of it, and so it collects all this radiation at the front as it goes. And when it arrives, all that radiation gets dumped on its destination, basically completely exterminate the planet it arrives at. That radiation is also incident within the shell itself. There's Hawking radiation occurring within the shell, which is pretty dangerous. And then it also has, it faces all sorts of exacerbations of the Fermi paradox, of course, as well. So you might be able to explain why we don't see a galactic empire. I mean, even here it's hard. You might be able to explain why we don't see a galactic empire if everybody's limited to Voyager 2 rocket speeds of like 20 kilometers per second or something. But it's a lot harder to explain why we don't see the stars populated by galactic empires when warp drive is eminently possible, because it makes expansion so much more trivial that it makes our life harder. There's some wonderful simulation work being done in Rochester where they actually simulate all the stars in the galaxy, or a fraction of them, and they spawn a civilization, and they let it run at their light speeds. And actually the very mixing of the stars themselves, because the stars are not static, they're in orbit in the galactic center, and they have crossing paths with each other. If you just have a range of even like 5 light years, and your speed is of order of a few percent the speed of light is the maximum you can muster, you can populate the entire galaxy within something like 100,000 to about 1 million years or so. So in a fraction of the lifetime of the galaxy itself. And so this raises some fairly serious problems, because if any civilization in the entire history of the galaxy decide to do that, then either we shouldn't be here, or we happen to live in this kind of rare pocket where they've chosen not to populate to. And so this is sometimes called fact A, Hart's fact A. As the fact A is that a civilization is not here now. An alien civilization is not in present occupation of the Earth, and that's difficult to resolve with the apparent ease at which even a small extrapolation of our own technology could potentially populate a galaxy in far faster than galactic history.
So, to me, by the way, the Fermi paradox is truly a paradox for me. But I suspect that if aliens visit Earth, I suspect if they do, if they are everywhere, I think they're already here, and we're too dumb to see it. But leaving that aside, I think we should be able to, in that case, have very strong, obvious signals when we look up at the stars, at the emanation of energy required. We would see some weirdness, that like where these are these kinds of stars and these are these kinds of stars that are being left here, like leveraging the nuclear fusion of stars to do something useful. Like the fact that we don't really see that, like maybe you can correct me. Wouldn't we be able to, if there is like alien civilizations running galaxies, wouldn't we see weirdnesses from an astronomy perspective with the way the stars are behaving?
I mean, it depends exactly what they're doing, but I mean, the Dyson Sphere example is one that we already discussed, where a survey of 100,000 nearby galaxies find that they have all been transformed into Dyson Sphere collectors. You could also imagine this recently star lifting, where you can extend the life of your star by scooping mass off the star, so you'd be doing stellar engineering essentially. Space, if you're doing a huge amount of asteroid mining, you would have a spectral signature, because you're basically filling the solar system with dust by doing debris from that activity. And so there are some limits on this. Certainly we don't see bright flashes, which would be one of these consequences of warp drive, as I said, is as they decelerate, they produce these bright flashes of light. We don't seem to see evidence of those kind of things. We don't see anything obvious around the nearby stars or the stars that we've surveyed in detail beyond that indicate any kind of artificial civilization. The closest maybe we had was Boyagin's star that there was a lot of interest in. There was a star that was just very peculiarly dipping in and out its brightness, and it was hypothesized for a time that may indeed be some kind of Dyson-like structure, so maybe a Dyson sphere that's half-dipped, and so as it comes in and out, it's blocking out huge swaths of the star. It was very difficult to explain it really with any kind of planet model at the time. But an easier hypothesis that was proposed was it could just be a large comets or dust or something, or maybe a planet that had broken apart as its fragments orbit around to block out starlight.
I did it!
It turned out, with subsequent observations of that star, which especially the amateurs from the community made a big contribution to as well, that the dips were chromatic, which is a real important clue that probably wasn't a solid structure then that was going around it. It was more likely to be dust. Dust is chromatic. By chromatic I mean it looks different in different colors. So it blocks out more red light than blue light. If it was a solid structure, it shouldn't do that. It should be opaque, right? A solid metal structure or something. So that was one of the clear indications, and the behavior of in the way the light changed or the dips changed across wavelength was fully consistent with the expectations of what small particulates would do. And so that's very hard. I mean, the real problem with alien hunting, the real problem. This is the real
one problem.
Yeah.
The one problem with warp drive and the one problem alien hunting. Yeah.
But, well, I'd say there's three big problems for me with any search for life, which includes UFOs all the way to fossils on Mars, is that aliens have three unique properties as a hypothesis. One is they have essentially unbounded explanatory capability. So there's almost no phenomena I can show you that you couldn't explain with aliens to some degree. You could say, well, the aliens just have some super high-tech way of creating that illusion. The second one would be unbounded avoidance capacity. So I might see a UFO tomorrow, next day, see it on Thursday, but then I don't see it. So I could always get out of it and say, well, that's just because they chose not to come here. You know, they have this, they can always avoid observations easily. If you survey the oxygen, you don't see methane, that doesn't mean that no one does. They either tricking their atmosphere, you wrote a paper about that, how you can use lasers to hide your biosignatures as advanced civilization. Or you could just be living underground or underwater or something where there's no biosignatures. So you can never... Then finally, the third one is that we have incomplete. We saw this new phenomenon of these strange dips we'd never seen before. It was hypothesized immediately this could be aliens. It's like a god of the gaps. But it turned out to be incomplete physical understanding. And so that happens all the time. In the first pulsar that was discovered, same story. Jocelyn Bell kind of somewhat tongue-in-cheek called it Little Green Man 1 because it looked a lot like the radio signature that was expected from alien civilization. But of course it turned out to be a completely new type of star that we had never seen before, which was a neutron star with these two jets coming out the top of it. And so that's a challenge. Those are really difficult in terms of experimental design for a scientist to work around. Something that can explain anything, can avoid anything, so it's almost unquantifiable, and could always just be, to some degree, as you said, we have this very limited knowledge, infinite possibilities of physical law, and we're probably only scratching the surface. Each time, and we've seen it so often in history, we may just be detecting some new phenomenon.
Well, that last one, I think I'm a little more okay with making mistakes on.
Yeah,
which is
because it's exciting still.
But because no matter, so you might exaggerate the importance of the discovery, but the whole point is to try to find stuff in this world that's weird and try to characterize that weirdness. Sure, you can throw a Little Green Man as a label on it, but eventually, it's as mysterious and as beautiful as interesting as Little Green Man. Like we tend to think that there's some kind of threshold. But like there's all kinds of weird organisms on this earth that operate very differently than humans that are super interesting. The human mind is super interesting. I mean, like weirdness and complexity is as interesting in any of its forms as what we might think from Hollywood what aliens are. So like that's okay. Looking for weirdnesses on Mars.
That's one of the best sales pitches to do technically in the world. Is that, you know, we always have that as our fallback, that look, we're going to look for alien signatures. If we fail, we're going to discover some new physics along the way. And so even any kind of signature that we detect is always going to be interesting. And so that compels us to have not only the question of looking for life in the universe, but it gives us a strong scientific grounding as to why sort of research should be funded and should be executed, because it always pushes the frontiers of knowledge.
I wonder if we'll be able to discover and be open enough to a broad definition of aliens, where we see some kind of technosignature. Basically, like this thing is intelligent. Like the processing information is very, very complex chemistry. It's a processing. This is storing information. This is propagating information over time. So, I mean,
Alright,
it's a gray area between a living
I'll be
organism
right back.
and
You
we
gotta
call
give
an
the
alien,
ears a little
and I
break
think
from the
that's super
headphones,
interesting.
otherwise
It's
they
able
get
to carry some
smushed.
kind of intelligence.
Information is a really useful way to frame what we're looking for, though, because then you're
45 minutes at a
divorced
time. That's
from
what Hideo Kojima
making
said.
assumptions about even
Might have
a
made that
civilization necessarily, or anything like that. So any kind of
BRB.
information-rich signature, indeed, you can take things like the light curve from Voyager's star and ask what is the minimum number of free parameters or the minimum information content that must be encoded within this light curve. And the hope is that maybe from, a good example would be from a radio signature, you detect something that has, 1,000 megabytes of parameters essentially contained within it. That's pretty clearly at that point not the product of a natural process, or at least any natural process that we could possibly imagine with our current understanding of the universe. And so thinking, even if we can't decode, which actually I'm skeptical we'd be able to ever decode it in our lifetimes, it would probably take decades to fully ever figure out what they're trying to tell us. But if there was a message there, we could at least know that there is high information content and there is complexity, and that this is a attempt at communication and information transfer, and leave it to our subsequent generations to figure out what exactly it is they're trying to say.
What, again, a wild question, and thank you for entertaining them. I really, really appreciate it. But what kind of signal in our lifetime, what kind of thing do you think might happen, could possibly happen, where the scientific community would be convinced that there's alien civilizations out there? And what, so you already said maybe a strong infrared signature, or something like a Dyson sphere.
That's possibly, that's also to some degree a little bit ambiguous, because...
Right, that's the challenge, sorry to interrupt, is where your brain would be, like you as a scientist, would be like, I know it's ambiguous, but this is really weird.
Yeah. I think if you had something, I can imagine something like a prime number sequence, or a mathematical sequence like the Fibonacci series, something being broadcast.
Mathematically provable that this is not a physical phenomenon.
Right. I mean, yeah, prime numbers is a pretty good case because there's no natural phenomena that produces prime number sequences. It seems to be a purely an abstract mathematical concept as far as I'm aware. And so if we detected, a series of radio blips that were following that sequence, it would be pretty clear to me. It would even be, Carl Sagan suggested that pi can be
Look at
encoded.
those bitches over there.
You might use the
the
hydrogen line,
fuck?
but multiplied by pi, like some very specific frequency of the universe, like a hydrogen line, but multiplied by an abstract mathematical constant that would imply strongly that there was someone
Stored in which phenomenon?
Well, not particular radio, but the information, we kind of toyed with this idea in a video I did about hypothetical civilization on my channel. But one kind of fun way, I do want to bring this conversation towards time a little bit, and thinking about not just looking for life and intelligence around us right now, but looking into the past and even into the future to some degree, or communicating with the future. And so we had this fun experiment of imagining a civilization that was born at the beginning of the history of the galaxy and being the first, and what it would be like for them. And they were desperately searching for evidence of life but couldn't find it. And so they decided to try and leave something behind for future civilizations to discover, to tell them about themselves. But of course, a radio signature is not going to work because it has to have a power source, and that's a piece of machinery. It's going to eventually break down. It's going to be hard to maintain that for billions of years timescale. And so you wanted something that was kind of passive, that doesn't require an energy source but can somehow transmit information, which is hard to think about something that satisfies those criteria. But there was a proposal by one of my colleagues, Luke Arnold, which inspired a lot of us in techno signatures. And he suggested that you could build artificial signatures. So you could build sheets of material that transit in front of a star. Maybe one thin sheet passes across first, then 2, then 3, then 5, then 7, so you could follow the prime number sequence of these. And so there'd be a clear indication that someone had manufactured those, but they don't require any energy source because they're just sheets of material in orbit of the star. They would eventually degrade from micrometeorites.
Give me your
maybe
stuff.
orbits would become destabilized, but they should have lifetimes far exceeding the lifetime of any battery or mechanical electronic system that we could, at least without technology, conceive of building. And so you could imagine then extending that, and how could you encode not just a prime number sequence, but maybe in the spatial pattern of this very complex light curve we see, you could encode more and more information through 2D shapes and the way those occultations happen. And maybe you could even encode messages and in-depth information from that. You know, you could even imagine it being like a lower layer of information, which is just the prime number sequence, but then you look closely and you see the smaller divots embedded in those that have a deeper layer of information to extract. And so to me, something like that would be somebody who would unless it's just a very impressive hoax, that would be a pretty compelling evidence for this civilization.
And actually, the methods of astronomy right now are kind of marching towards being able to better and better detect a signal like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just building bigger aperture in space. The bigger the telescope, the finer ability to detect those minute signals.
Do you think the current sort of the scientific community, another weird question, but just the observations that are happening now, do you think they're ready for a prime number sequence? In the sort of if we're using the current method, the transit timing variation method, like, do you think you're ready? Do you have the tools to detect the prime number sequence?
Man, that stuff is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's 200,000 stars that Kepler monitored, and it monitored them all the time. It took a photo of each one of them every 30 minutes, measured their brightness, and it did that for 4.5 years. And so you have already, Tesla's doing it right now in another mission. And so you have already an existing catalog, and people are genuinely scouring through each of those light curves with automated machine learning techniques. We even developed some in our own team that can look for weird behavior. We wrote a code called the weird detector, for instance, that, of course, you know, it was just the most generic thing possible. Don't assume anything about the signal shape. Just look for anything that repeats. The signal shape can be anything, and we kind of learn the template of the signal from the data itself, and then it's like a template matching filter to see if that repeats many times in the data. And so we actually applied that and found a bunch of interesting stuff, but we didn't see anything that was a prime number sequence, at least in the Kepler data. That's 200,000 stars, which sounds like a lot, but compared to 200 billion stars in the Milky Way, it's really just scratching the surface.
So because there could be something much more generalizable than the prime number sequence. It's ultimately the question of a signal that's very difficult to compress in the general sense of what compressed means. So maybe as we get better and better machine learning methods that automatically analyze the data to understand how to compress it, you'll be able to discover data that's for some reason is not compressible. But then, you know, compression really is a bottomless pit, because like that's really what intelligence is being able to compress information.
Yeah, and to some degree, the more I would imagine, I don't work in compression algorithms, but I would imagine the more you compress your signal, the more assumptions that kind of go on behalf of the decoder, the more skilled they really have to be. You know, some of a prime number sequence is completely unencoded information, essentially. But if you look at the Arecibo message, they were fairly careful with their pixelation of this simple image they sent to try and make it as interpretable as possible, to be that even a dumb alien will be able to figure out what we're trying to show them here, because there's all sorts of conventions and rules that are built in that we tend to presume when we design our messages. And so if your messages, assuming they know how to do an MP3 decoder, a particular compression algorithm, I'm sure they could eventually reverse engineer it and figure it out, but you're making it harder for them to get to that point. So maybe I always think you probably would have a 2-tier system, right? You'd probably have some lower tier key system, and then maybe beneath that you'd have a deeper
he's a chain
compressed
gunner.
layer of more in-depth information.
What about maybe observing actual physical objects? So first, let me go to your tweet, the source of inspiration. You tweeted that you ponder that orb clouds are ever mined by the systems of alien civilizations. Mining equipment from billions of years ago could be in our Oort cloud, since the Oort clouds they extend really far outside the actual star. So mining equipment, just a basic boring mining equipment out there. I don't know if there's something interesting to say about Oort clouds themselves that they're interesting to you, and about possible non-shiny light emitting mining.
Run!
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of
Watch out, Skittles!
is you can find inspiration and interest in just the smallest little thing that starts a whole thread of building upon it and wondering about the implications. And so in this case, I was just really struck by we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier.
Still don't
the
have
idea
my
that
blue key, huh?
stars are not static. We tend to
I
think
had
of
a
the
blue
galaxy
key. Where the fuck did I get
as
it?
having stars in a certain location from the center of the galaxy, and they kind of live there. But in truth, the stars are not only orbiting around the center of the galaxy, but those orbits are themselves changing over time. They're precessing. And so in fact, the orbit's more like a spirograph, if you ever done those as a kid. It kind of whirl around and trace out all sorts of strange patterns. And so the stars intersect with one another. And so the current closest star is Proxima Centauri, which is about 4.2 light years away. But it will not always be the closest star. Over millions of years, it will be surpassed by other stars. In fact, stars will come even closer to Proxima in just a couple of light years. And that's been happening, not just we can project that will happen over the next few million years, but that's been happening presumably over the galaxy for millions of years. And so back in time,
We make a good team,
all
Skittles.
sorts of different nearest stars throughout different stages of the Earth's history. And those stars are so close that their Oort clouds do intermix with one another. So the Oort cloud can extend out to even a light year or two around the Earth. There's some debate about exactly where it ends. It probably doesn't really have a definitive end, but kind of peters out more and more and more as you go further away.
By the way, for people who don't know, an Oort cloud, I don't know what the technical definition is, but a bunch of rocks that objects that orbit the star, and they can extend really
Correct. So
really
these
far.
are objects that probably they were probably fairly similar distances to Jupiter and Saturn, but were
there's a bad
scattered
guy over
out
here.
through
Come on.
the interactions of those
Skittles,
giant
I don't
planets.
trust you. You're
We
gonna
see
die
a
if you come over
circular
here.
disk of objects
Come on.
around us, which kind of looks like the asteroid
Come
belt,
up
but
here.
just further away, called the
Now.
Kuiper belt.
Stay
And then
frosty.
further beyond that,
Stay.
you get the Oort cloud. And the Oort cloud is not on a disk; it's just a sphere. It kind of surrounds us in all directions. So these are objects that were scattered out through three-dimensionally in all different directions. And so those objects are potentially resources for us, especially if you were planning to start a mission one day. You might want to mine the water and use that as either oxygen or fuel for your rocket. And so it's quite possible, also some rare earth metals and things like that as well, but it's quite possible that a civilization might use Oort cloud objects as a jumping off point. Or in the Kuiper belt you have things like Planet 9 even. There might even be objects beyond in the Oort cloud that are actually planet-like that we just cannot detect. These objects are very, very faint, so that's why they're so hard to see. I mean, even Planet 9 is hypothesized to exist, but we've not been able to confirm its existence because it's at something like 1,000 AU away from us, 1,000 times the distance of the Earth from the Sun. And so even though it's probably larger than the Earth, the amount of light it reflects from the sun is
We
sort of
did
like a
it!
star at that point, so far away from it that it barely reflects anything back. It's extremely difficult to detect. So there's all sorts of wonders that may be lurking out in the outer solar
We
system.
really did it.
And so this
Skittles.
leads you to wonder,
Good job.
in the Oort cloud, that Oort cloud must have intermixed with other Oort clouds in the past. And so what fraction of the Oort cloud truly belongs to us, belongs to what was scattered from Jupiter and Saturn? What fraction of it could in fact be interstellar visitors? And of course we've got excited about this recently because of Oumuamua, this interstellar asteroid. which seemed to be at the time the first evidence of an interstellar object. But when you think about the Oort cloud intermixing, it may be that a large fraction of comets are seeded from the Oort cloud that eventually come in. Some of those comets may indeed have been interstellar in the first place that we just didn't know about through this process. There even is an example, I can't remember the name, there's an example of a comet that has a very peculiar spectral signature that has been hypothesized to have actually been an interstellar visitor, but one that was essentially sourced through this Oort cloud mixing. And so this is kind of intriguing. It also, the outer solar system is just it's like at the bottom of the ocean. We know so little about what's on the bottom of our own planet's ocean, and we know next to nothing about what's on the outskirts of our own solar system.
It's all darkness.
Yeah.
So like, that's one of the things is to understand the phenomena, we need light. And we need to see how light interacts with it, or what light emanates from it. But most of our universe is darkness, so there could be a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, this is where your interest is with the cool worlds, and the interesting stuff lurks in the darkness, right?
Basically, all of us, 400 years of astronomy, our only window into the universe has been light. And that has only changed quite recently with the discovery of gravitational waves. That's now a new window. And hopefully, well, to some degree, I guess, solar neutrinos we've been detecting for, they come from the sun and star space. But we may be able to see detect neutrino messages to hypothesize the way to communicate. Or to do neutrino telescopes to the universe. And so there's a growing interest in what we call multi-messenger astronomy now. So not just messages from light, but messages from other physical packets of information that are coming our way. But when it comes to the outer solar system, light really is our only window. There's two ways of doing that. One is you detect the light from the Oort cloud object itself, which, as I just said, is very, very difficult. There's another trick, which we do in the Kuiper belt especially, and that's called an occultation. And so sometimes those objects will just pass in front of a distant star, just coincidentally. These are very, very brief moments. They last for less than a second. Very fast detectors, which conventionally astronomers don't usually do on fast cameras. Most of the phenomena we observe occurs in hours, minutes, days even. But now we're developing cameras which can take thousands of images per second, and yet do it at the kind of astronomical fidelity that we need for this kind of precise measurement. And so you can see these very fast dips. You even get these kind of diffraction patterns that come around, which are really cool to look at. And I kind of love it because it's almost like passive radar. You have these pinpricks of light. Imagine that you live in a giant black sphere, but there's these little pinholes that have been poked, and through those pinholes almost laser light shining through. And inside this sphere, there are unknown things wandering around, listing around that we are trying to discover. And sometimes they will pass in front of those little pencil-thin laser beams, block something out, and so we can tell that it's there. And it's not an active radar because we didn't actually beam anything out and get a reflection off, which is what the sun does. The sunlight comes off and it comes back. That's more like an active radar system. This is more like a passive radar system where we are just listening very intently. And so I'm kind of so fascinated by that, the idea that we could map out the rich architecture of the outer solar system just by doing something that we could have done potentially for a long time ago, which is just listening in the right way, just tuning our instrumentation to the correct way of not listening but viewing the universe to catch those objects.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. It seems almost obvious that your efforts, when projected out in over like 100, 200 years, will have a really good map. Through even methods like basically transit timing, high resolution transit timing, but basically the planetary and the planet's satellite movements that of all the different star systems out there.
Yeah, and it could revolutionize the way we think about the solar system. I mean, that revolution has happened several times in the past. When we discovered Vesta in the 19th century, that was, I think, the seventh planet for a while, or the eighth planet when it was first discovered, and then we discovered Ceres, and there was a bunch of asteroid objects, Janus, and so for a while the textbooks had there was something like 13 planets in the solar system, And then that was just a new capability that was emerging to detect those small objects. And then we ripped that up and said, no, we're going to change the definition of a planet. And then the same thing happened when we started looking at the outer skirts of the solar system again. We found Eris, we found Sedna, these objects which resembled Pluto. And the more and more of them we found, make. And eventually we again had to rethink the way we even contextualize what a planet is and what the nature of the outer solar system is. So regardless as to what you think about the debate about whether Pluto should be demoted or not, which I know often evokes a lot of strong feelings, it is an incredible achievement that
Fuck yourself!
we were able to transform our view of the solar system in a matter of years just by basically, charge-coupled devices, the things that's in cameras. Though the invention of that device allowed us to detect objects which were much further away, much fainter, and revealed all of this stuff that was there all along. And so
Where did I get this
that's
red
the beauty
key?
of astronomy. There's just so much to discover, and even in our own backyard.
Do you ever think about this? Do you imagine what are the things that will completely change astronomy over the next 100 years? Like if you transport yourself forward 100 years, what are the things that will blow your mind when you look at, wait, what? Would it be just a very high resolution mapping of things? Like, holy
go,
crap.
Skills?
Like one surprising thing might be, holy crap, there's like Earth-like moons everywhere.
Yeah.
And another one could be just totally different devices for sensing.
Yeah, I think usually astronomy moves forward dramatically, and science in general, when you have a new technological capability come online for the first time. And we kind of just gave examples of that there with the solar system. So what kind of new capabilities might emerge in the next 100 years? The capability I would love to see is not just in the next 10, 20 years, we're hoping to take these pale blue dot images we spoke about. So that requires building something like JWST, but on an even larger scale, and
Damn it.
optimized for direct imaging. You'd have to have either coronagraph or a star shade or something to block out the starlight and reveal those pale blue dots. So in the next sort of decades, I think that's the achievement that we can look forward to in our lifetimes, is to see photos of other Earths. Going beyond that, maybe in our lifetimes, towards the end of our lifetimes perhaps, I'd love it if we, I think it's technically possible, as Breakthrough Starshot are giving us a lot of encouragement with, to maybe send a small probe to the nearest stars and start actually taking high resolution images of these objects. There's only so much you can do from far away. If you want to have, and we can see it in the solar system, I mean, there's only so much you can learn about Europa by pointing a Hubble Space Telescope at it, but if you really want to understand that moon, you're going to have to send something to orbit it to hopefully land on it and draw it to the surface. And so the idea of even taking a flyby and doing a snapshot photo that gets beamed back, that could be, doesn't even have to be more than 100 pixels by 100 pixels, that would be a completely game-changing capability to be able to truly image these objects. And maybe at home in our own solar system, we can certainly get to a point where we produce crude maps of exoplanets. One of the kind of the ultimate limit of what a telescope could do is governed by its size. And so the largest telescope you could probably ever build would be one that was the size of the sun. There's a clever trick for doing this without physically building a telescope that's the size of the sun, and that's to use the sun as a gravitational lens. This was proposed, I think, by
That's a fantastic idea.
1979, but it builds upon Einstein's theory of general relativity, of course, that there is a warping of light, a bending of light from the sun's gravitational field. And so a distant starlight is like a magnifying glass. Anything that bends light is basically can be used as a telescope. It's going to bend light to a point. Now it turns out the sun's gravity is not strong enough to create a particularly great telescope here, because the focus point is really out in the Kaiser belt. It's at 550 astronomical units away. It's 550 times further away from the sun than we are, and we see that beyond the spacecraft have ever gone. So you have to send a spacecraft to that distance, which would take 30, 40 years, but optimistically improving our chemical propulsion system significantly. You have to ground it into that orbit, but then you could use the entire sun as your telescope, and with that kind of capability, you could image planets to kilometer scale resolution. And that really makes you wonder. I mean, if we can conceive, maybe we can't engineer it, but if we can conceive of such a device, what might other civilizations be currently observing about our own planet? No. And perhaps that is why nobody is visiting, because there is so much you can do from afar that to them that's enough. Maybe they can get to the point where they can detect our radio leakage, they can detect our terrestrial television signals, they can map out our surfaces, they can tell we have cities, they can even do infrared mapping of the heat island effect and all this kind of stuff. They can tell the chemical composition of our planet, and so that might be enough. Maybe they don't need to come down to the surface so that you have to do anthropology and see where our civilization is. But there's certainly a huge amount you can do, which is significantly cheaper to somebody
Get
who's
off,
flying
scum!
just by exploiting cleverly the physics of the universe itself.
So your intuition is, this very well may be true, that observation might be way easier than travel. From our perspective, from an alien perspective, like we could get very high resolution imaging before we can ever get there.
It depends on what information you want. If you want to know the chemical composition and you want to know kilometer scale maps of the planet, then you could do that from afar with some version of these kind of gravitational lenses. If you want to do better than that, if you want to image a newspaper sat on the porch of somebody's house, you're going to have to fly there. There's no way, unless you had, a telescope that's the size of Sagittarius A star or something, you just simply cannot collect enough light to do that from many light years away. So there is certainly reasons why visiting will always have its place, depending on what kind of information you want.
Oh, I got the red key.
We proposed in my team actually that the sun is the ultimate pinnacle
That's
of
what it
telescope
is.
design, but flying to 1,000 AU is a real pain in the butt because it's just going to take so long. And so a more practical way of achieving this might be to use the Earth. Now the Earth doesn't have anywhere near enough gravity to create a substantial gravitational lens, but it has an atmosphere. And that atmosphere refracts
I wanna try
light,
this again.
it bends light. So whenever you see a sunset, just as the sun's setting below the horizon, it's actually already
You
beneath
are
the
the
horizon.
you
It's
are at
just
the heart of the
light
corrupt
is
city,
bending
surrounded by the corpses
through
of
the
your
atmosphere.
enemies.
It's actually
You
already
see
about
no
half a degree
way to
down
destroy the
beneath, and
creatures.
what you're seeing
Entryway
is
on
that-
the side.
is that
So you
curvature
clench
of
your
the light
teeth
path.
and plunge.
And your
through.
brain interprets it, of course, to be
There must
following
be a
straight
way to
line,
close
because
it on
your
the
brain
other
always thinks
side.
that.
What do you care if
And
you
so
gotta go
you can
through
use
hell
that
to get
bending.
it?
Whenever you have bending, you have a telescope. And so we've proposed in my team
Hey,
that you
Skittles.
can use this refraction to similarly create an Earth-sized telescope.
Oh, the Terrascope.
The Terrascope.
We have a
yeah.
great video on this.
Yeah. And,
Do you have a paper on the Terrascope?
I do. Yeah.
Great.
They've heard of an Earth-sized telescope, which is the Event Horizon telescope, which took an image of, it's taking an image right now of the center of our black hole. And it's very impressive, and this previously did Messier 87, a nearby supermassive black hole. And so those images were interferometric. So they were small telescopes scattered across the Earth, and they combined the light paths together interferometrically to create effectively an Earth-sized angular resolution. Telescopes always have two properties. There's the angular resolution, which is how small of a thing you can see on the surface, and then there's the magnification. How much brighter does that object get versus just your eye or some small object? Now, what the Event Horizon Telescope did, it traded off amplification or magnification for the angular resolution. That's what it wanted. It wanted that high angular resolution, but it doesn't really have much photon collecting power because each telescope individually is very small. The Terrascope is different because it is literally collecting light with a light bucket, which is essentially the size of the Earth. And so that gives you both benefits potentially. Not only the high angular resolution that a large aperture promises you, but also actually physically collects all those photons, so you can detect light from very, very far away, the very outer edges of the universe. And so we proposed this as a possible future technological way of achieving these extreme goals, ambitious goals we have in astronomy. But it's a very difficult system to test because you essentially have to fly out to these focus points, and these focus points lie beyond the moon. So you have to have someone who is willing to fly be on the moon and hitchhike an experimental telescope onto it and do that cheaply. If it was something doing low Earth orbit, it'd be easy. You could just attach a CubeSat to the next Falcon 9 rocket or something and test it out. It'd probably only cost you a few tens of thousands of dollars, maybe $100,000. But there's basically no one who flies out that far except for bespoke missions, such as like a mission that's going to Mars or something that would pass through that kind of space. And they typically don't have a lot of leeway in excess payload that they're willing to strap on for radical experiments. So that's been the problem with it. In theory, it should work beautifully, but it's a very difficult idea to experimentally test.
Can you elaborate why the focal point is that far away?
So you get about half a degree bend from the Earth's atmosphere when you're looking at the sun at the horizon, and you get that 2 times over if you're outside of the planet's atmosphere, because it comes, the star is half a bend to you still on the horizon, then half a degree back out the other way, so you get about a 1 degree bend. You take the radius of the Earth, which is about 7,000 kilometers, and do your arctan function, you'll end up with a distance that's about, it's actually the inner focal point is about 2/3 the distance of the Earth-Moon system. The problem with that inner focal point is not useful, because that light ray path had to basically scrape the surface of the Earth. So it passes through the clouds, it passes through all the thick atmosphere, it gets a lot of extinction along the way. If you go higher up in altitude, you get less extinction. In fact, you can even go above the clouds, and so that's even better, because the clouds obviously are going to be a pain in the neck for doing anything optical. But the problem with that is that the atmosphere, because it gets thinner at higher altitude, it bends light less. And so that pushes the focal point out. So the most useful focal point is actually about 3 or 4 times the distance of the Earth-Moon separation. And so that's what we call one of the Lagrange points, essentially, out there. And so there is a stable orbit. It's kind of the outermost stable orbit you could have around the Earth.
So the atmosphere does bad things to the signal of, of light.
It's absorbing light.
Is that possible to reconstruct this, to remove the noise, whatever? So it's just strength. It's nothing else.
It's possible to reconstruct. I mean, to some degree, we do this. There's a technology called adaptive optics that can correct for what's called wavefront errors that happen through the Earth's atmosphere. The Earth's atmosphere is turbulent. It is not a single plane of air of the same density. There's all kind of wiggles and currents in the air. And so that each little layer is bending light in slightly different ways. And so the light actually kind of follows a wiggly path on its way down. What that means is that 2 light rays, which are traveling at slightly different spatial separations from each other, will arrive at the detector at different times, because one maybe goes on more or less a straight path and the other one wiggles down a bit more before it arrives. And so you have an incoherent light source. And when you're trying to do image reconstruction, you always want a coherent light source. So the way they correct for this is that if this path had to travel a little bit faster, the straight one goes faster and the wiggly one takes longer, the mirror is deformable, and so you actually bend the mirror on the straight one down a little bit to make it an equivalent light path distance. So the mirror itself has all these little actuators, and it's actually made up of like thousands of little elements. Almost looks like a liquid mirror, because they can manipulate it in kind of real time. And so they scan the atmosphere with a laser beam to tell what the deformations are in the atmosphere, and then make the corrections to the mirror to account for it.
That's amazing.
So you could do something like this for the telescope, but it would be
It's cheaper and easier to go above the atmosphere and just fly out.
I think so. It would be that's a very challenging thing to do. And normally when you do adaptive optics, as it's called, you're looking straight up. So you're, or very close to straight up. If you look at the horizon, we basically never do astronomical observations on the horizon because you're looking through more atmosphere. If you go straight up, you're looking at the thinnest portion of atmosphere possible. But as you go closer and closer towards the horizon, you're increasing what we call the air mass, the amount of air you have to travel through. So here it's kind of the worst case because you're going through the entire atmosphere in and out again with a telescope. So you'd need a very impressive adaptive optics system to correct for that. So yeah, I would say it's probably simpler, at least for proof of principle, just to test it with having some satellite that was at a much wider orbit.
Now, speaking of traveling out into deep space, you already mentioned this a little bit. You made a beautiful video called The Journey to the End of the Universe. And sort of at the start of that, you're talking about Alpha Centauri. So what would it take for humans or for human-like creatures to travel out to Alpha Centauri?
there's a few different ways of doing it, I suppose. One is, it depends on how fast your ship is. That's always going to be the determining factor. If we devised some interstellar propulsion system that could travel a fraction of the speed of light, then we could do it in our lifetimes, which is, I think, what people normally dream of when they think about interstellar propulsion and travel. That you could literally step onto the spacecraft, maybe a few years later you step off on Alpha Centauri B, you walk around the surface and come back and visit your family. There would be, of course, a lot of relativistic time dilation as a result of that trip. You would have aged a lot less than people back on Earth by traveling close to the speed of light for some fraction of time. The challenge of this, of course, is that we have no such propulsion system that can achieve this. So,
but you think it's possible? Like, so you have a paper called the Halo Drive, fuel-free relativistic propulsion of large masses via recycled boomerang photons. So, do you think, first of all, what is that? And second of all, how difficult are alternate propulsion systems?
Yeah, so before I took in the Halo Drive, there was an idea, because I think the Halo Drive is not going to solve this problem. I'll talk about the Halo Drive in a moment, but the Halo Drive is useful for a civilization which is a bit more advanced than us, that has spread across the stars, and is looking for a cheap highway system to get across the galaxy. For that first step, because just to context that, the Halo Drive requires a black hole, so that's why you're not going to be able to do this on the Earth right now. But there are lots of black holes in the Milky Way, so that's the good news. So we'll come to that in a moment. But if you're trying to travel to Alpha Centauri without a black hole, then the most, there are some ideas out there. There was a Project Daedalus and Project Icarus that were two projects that the British Interplanetary Society conjured up on sort of a 20, 30-year timescale. And they asked themselves, if we took existing and speculatively but realistic attempts at future technology that are emerging over the next few decades, how far could we push an interstellar travel system? And they settled on fusion drives in that. So if we had the ability to essentially either detonate, you can always imagine that kind of nuclear fission or nuclear fusion bombs going off behind the spacecraft and propelling it that way, or having some kind of successful nuclear fusion reaction, which obviously we haven't really demonstrated yet as a propulsion system, then you could achieve something like 10% the speed of light in those systems. But these are huge spacecrafts, and I think you need a huge spacecraft if you're going to take people along. The conversation recently has actually switched, and that idea is kind of seems a little bit antiquated now, and most of us have kind of given up on the idea of people physically, biologically stepping on board the spacecraft. And maybe we'll be sending something that's more like a microprobe that maybe just weighs a gram or two, and that's much easier to accelerate. You could push that with a laser system to very high speed, get it to maybe 20% the speed of light. It has to survive the journey. Probably a large fraction of them won't survive the journey, but they're cheap enough that you could maybe manufacture millions of them, and some of them do arrive and are able to send back an image, or maybe even if you wanted to have a person there, we might have some way of doing like a telepresence or some kind of delayed telepresence, or some kind of reconstruction of the planet which is sent back, so you can digitally interact with that environment.
You need to take care of your knees.
Not real time,
take care of your
representative
knees
of what that planet would be like to be on the surface. So we might be more like digital visitors to these planets. Certainly far easier practically to do that than physically forcing this wet chunk of meat to fly light years across space to do that. And so that's maybe something we can imagine down the road. The Halo Drive, as I said, is thinking even further ahead. And if you did want to launch large masses could even be planet-sized things. In the case of the Halo Drive, you can use black holes. So this is kind of a trick of physics. I often think of the universe as like a big computer game, and you're trying to find cheat codes, hacks, exploits that the universe didn't intend for you to use. But once you find them, you can address all sorts of interesting capabilities that you didn't previously have. Yeah. And the Halo Drive does that with black holes. So if you have two black holes, which are a very common situation, a binary black hole, and they're spiraling towards each other, LIGO's detected, I think, dozens of these things, maybe even over 100 at this point. And these things, as they merge together, they the pre-merger phase, they're orbiting each other very, very fast, even close to the speed of light. And so Freeman Dyson, before he passed away, I think in the 70s, he had this provocative paper called Gravitational Machines, and he suggested that you could use neutron stars as an interstellar propulsion system. And neutron stars are sort of the lower mass version of a binary black hole system, essentially. In this case, he suggested just doing gravitational slingshot. Just fly your spacecraft into this very compact and relativistic binary system. And you do need neutron stars because if there were two stars, they'd be physically touching each other. So the neutron stars are so small, like 10 kilometers across, they can get really close to each other and have these very, very fast orbits with respect to each other. You shoot your spacecraft right through the middle, like flying through the eye of a needle, and you do a slingshot around one of them, and you do it around the one that's coming sort of towards you. So one of them be coming away, one of them be coming towards you at any one point, and then you could basically steal some of the kinetic energy in the slingshot. In principle, you can set up to twice the speed. You can take your speed, and it becomes your speed plus twice the speed of the neutron star in this case, and that would be your new speed after the slingshot. This seems great because it's just free energy, basically. You're not doing any, you're not generating, you don't have a nuclear power reactor or anything to generate this, you're just stealing it. And indeed, you can get to relativistic speeds this way. So I loved that paper, but I had a criticism, and the criticism was that this is like trying to fly your ship into a blender, right? This is two neutron stars, which have huge tidal forces, and they're whipping around each other once every second or even less than a second, and you're trying to fly your spaceship and do this maneuver that is pretty precarious. And so it just didn't seem practical to me to do this, but I loved it. And so I took that idea, and this is how science is. It's iterative. It's you take a previous great man's idea and you just sort of maybe slightly tweak it and improve it. And that's how I see the halo drive. And I just suggested, why not replace those out for black holes, which is certainly very common. And rather than flying your ship into that hellhole of a blender system, you just stand back and you fire a laser beam. Now, because black holes have such intense gravitational fields, they can bend light into complete 180s. They can actually become mirrors. So, the sun bends light by maybe a fraction of a degree through gravitational lensing, but a compact object like a black hole can do a full 180. In fact, if you went too close, if you put the laser beam too close, the black hole would just fall into it and never come back out. So you just kind of push it out until you get to a point where it's just skirting the event horizon. And then that laser beam skirts around and it comes back. Now the laser beam wants to do it is doing a gravitational slingshot, but light, photons can't speed up in like the spaceship case. So instead of speeding up, the way they steal energy is they increase their frequency. So they become higher energy photon packets, essentially. They get blue shifted. So that you send maybe a red laser beam and it comes back blue, it's got more energy in it. And because photons carry momentum, which is somewhat unintuitive in everyday experience, but they do. That's how solar sails work. They carry momentum, they push things. You can even use them as laser tweezers and things to pick things up. Because they push, it comes back with more momentum than it left. So you get an acceleration force from this. And again, you're just stealing energy from the black hole to do that. So you can get up to the same speed. It's basically the same idea as Freeman Dyson, but doing it from a safer distance. And there should be of order of 1 million or so, or 10 million black holes in the Milky Way galaxy. Some of them would be even as close as sort of 10 to 20 light years when you do the occurrence rate statistics of how close you might expect feasibly one to be. They're of course difficult to detect because they're black, so they're inherently hard to see. But statistically, there should be plenty out there in the Milky Way. And so these objects would be natural waypoint stations. You could use them to both accelerate away and to brake and slow down.
Oh, and on top of all this, we've been talking about astronomy and cosmology. There's been a lot of exciting breakthroughs in detection and exploration of black holes. So the boomeranging photons that you're talking about, there's been a lot of work on photon rings and just all the fun stuff going on outside the black holes.
Yeah.
So all the garbage outside might be the thing that holds a key to understanding what's going on inside. And there's the Hawking radiation. There's all kinds of fascinating stuff like I mean, there's trippy stuff about black holes that I can't even. Well, most people don't understand. I mean, the holographic principle with the plate and the information being stored potentially outside of the black hole. I can't even comprehend how you can project a three-dimensional object onto 2D and somehow store information where it doesn't destroy it, and if it does destroy it, challenging all of physics. All of this is very interesting, especially for kind of more practical applications of how the black hole can be used for propulsion.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that black holes are used in all sorts of ways by advanced civilizations. I think, again, it's been a popular idea in science fiction, or science fiction trope, that Sagittarius A star, the supermassive black hole in the Sagittarius galaxy, could be the best place to look for intelligent life in the universe, because it is a giant engine in a way. You know, a unique capability of a black hole is you can basically throw matter into it, and you can get these jets that come out, the accretion disks and the jets that fly out, and so you can more or less use them to convert matter into energy, V equals mc squared, and there's pretty much nothing else except for, you know, annihilation with its own antiparticle as a way of doing that. So they have some unique properties. You could perhaps power civilization by just throwing garbage into a black hole, right? Just throwing asteroids in, and you power your civilization with as much energy as you really would ever plausibly need. And you could also use them to accelerate away across the universe. And you can even imagine using small artificial black holes as thermal generators, right? So the Hawking radiation from them kind of exponentially increases as they get smaller and smaller in size. And so a very small black hole, one that you could almost imagine like holding in your hand, would be a fairly significant heat source. And so that raises all sorts of prospects about how you might use that in an engineering context to power your civilization as well.
You have a video on becoming a Kardashev Type 1 civilization. What's our hope for doing that? We're a few orders of magnitude away from that.
Yeah, it is surprising. I think people tend to think that we're close to this scale. The Kardashev Type 1 is defined as a civilization which is using as much energy as is essentially incident upon the planet from the star. So that's of order, I think, for the Earth of something like 10 to the 5 terawatts or 10 to the 7 terawatts. It's a gigantic amount of energy, and we're using a tiny fraction of that right now. So, you know, if you became a Kardashev Type 1 civilization, which is seen not necessarily as a goal into itself, I think people think, well, why are we aspiring to become this energy-hungry civilization? You know, surely our energy needs might become, you know, might improve our efficiency or something as time goes on. But ultimately, the more energy you have access to, the greater your capabilities will be. I mean, if you want to lift Mount Everest into space, there is just a calculable amount of potential energy change that's going to take in order to accomplish that. And the more energy you have access to as a civilization, then clearly the easier that energy achievement is going to be. So it depends on what your aspirations are as a civilization. It might not be something you want to ever do, but...
Well, but we should make clear that lifting heavy things isn't the only thing. It's doing work. So
yeah,
it could be computation. It could be
right.
It could be more and more sophisticated and larger and larger computation. Which is, it does seem where we're headed, with a very fast increase in the scale and the quality of our computation outside the human brain, artificial computation.
Yeah, I mean, computation is a great example of. I mean, already I think something like 10% of U.S. power electricity use is going towards these supercomputing centers. So there's a vast amount of our current energy needs which are already going towards computing, will surely only increase over time. If we start ever doing anything like mind uploading or creating simulated realities, that cost will surely become almost a dominant source of our energy requirements at that point, if civilization completely moves over to this kind of post-humanism stage. And so it's not unreasonable that our energy needs would continue to grow. Certainly historically, they always have at about 2% per year. And so if that continues, there is going to be a certain point where you're running up against the amount of energy which you can harvest, because you're using even if you cover the entire planet in solar panels, there's no more energy to be had. And so this is there's a few ways of achieving this. I sort of talked about in the video how there were several renewable energy sources that we're excited about, like geothermal, wind power, waves, but pretty much all of those don't really scratch the surface or don't really scratch the itch of getting to a Kardashev Type 1 civilization. They're meaningful now. I would never be telling you don't do wind power now because it's clearly used for our current stage of civilization, but it's not. It's going to be a pretty negligible fraction of our energy requirements if we got to that stage of development. And so there has to be a breakthrough in either our ability to harvest solar energy, which would require maybe something like a space array of solar panels of beaming the energy back down, or some developments and innovations in nuclear fusion that would allow us to essentially reproduce the same process of what's producing the solar photons, but here on Earth. But even that comes with some consequences. If you're generating the energy here on Earth and you're doing work on it on Earth, then that work is going to produce waste heat, and that waste heat is going to increase the ambient temperature. And so, even if this isn't really a greenhouse effect that just increases the temperature, this is just the amount of computers that are churning. You put your hands up here, you can feel the warmth coming off them. If you do that much work of literally, the entire instant energy of the planet is doing that work, the planet is going to warm up significantly as a result of that. And so, that's that clearly indicates that this is not a sustainable path, that civilizations as they approach Kardashev Type 1 are going to have to leave planet Earth, which is really the point of that video, to show that it's a Kardashev Type 1 civilization, even though it's defined as instant energy upon a planet, that is not a species that is going to still be living on their planet, at least in isolation. They will have to be harvesting energy from afar. They will have to be doing work on that energy outside of their planet, because otherwise you're going to dramatically change the environment in which you live.
Well, yeah, so the more energy you create, the more energy you use, the higher the imperative to expand out into the universe, but also not just the imperative, but the capabilities. Mm-hmm. And you've kind of, as a side on your lab page, mentioned that you're sometimes interested in astroengineering. So what kind of space architectures do you think we can build to house humans or interesting things outside of Earth?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fun ideas here. One of the classic ideas is an O'Neill cylinder or a Stanford torus. These are like two rotating structures that were devised in space. They're basically using the centrifugal force as artificial gravity. And so these are structures which tend to be many kilometers across that you're building in space, but could potentially habitat millions of people in orbit of the Earth. Of course, you could imagine pulling them, the Expanse does a pretty good job, I think, of exploring the idea of human exploration of the solar system and having many objects, many of the small near-Earth objects and asteroids inhabited by mining colonies. One of the ideas we've played around with our group is this technology called a quasite. A quasite is an extension. Again, we always tend to extend previous ideas. Ideas build upon ideas. But an extension idea called a statite. A statite was an idea proposed, I think, by Ron Forward in the 1970s. 1970s seemed to have all sorts of wacky ideas. I don't know what was going on then. We had I think the Stanford torus, the O'Neill cylinder, statites, the gravitational lens. People were really having fun with dreaming about space in the 70s. The statite is basically a solar sail, but it's such an efficient solar sail that the outward force of radiation pressure equals the inward force of gravity from the sun. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't need to orbit. Normally you avoid, the sun is pulling us right now through force of gravity, but we are not getting closer towards the sun, even though we are falling towards the sun because we're in orbit, which means our translational speed is just enough to keep us at the same altitude, essentially, from the sun. And so you're in orbit, and that's how you maintain distance. A statite doesn't need to do that. It can be basically, completely static in inertial space, but it's just balancing the two forces of radiation pressure and inward gravitational pressure. A quasite is the in-between of those two states. So it has some significant outward pressure, but not enough to resist fully falling into the star. And so it compensates for that by having some translational motion. So it's in between an orbit and a statite. And so what that allows you to do is maintain artificial orbits. So normally, if you want to calculate your orbital speed of something at, say, half an AU, you would use Kepler's third law and go through that, and you'd say, okay, if it's at half an AU, I can calculate the period by p squared is proportional to a cubed and go through that. But for a quasite, you can basically have any speed you want. It's just a matter of how much of the gravitational force are you balancing out. You effectively enter an orbit where you're making the mass of the star be less massive than it really is. So it's as if you were orbiting a 0.1 solar mass star or a 0.2 solar mass star, whatever you want. And so that means
All right, Skittles.
Mercury orbits with a pretty fast pretty fast orbital speed around the sun because it's closer to the sun than we are. But we could put something in Mercury's orbit that would have a slower speed, and so
Why
it
you
would
always have to get
co-track
captured,
with the Earth. And so we would always be aligned with them at all times. And so this could be useful if you wanted to have a either a chain of colonies or something that were able to easily communicate and move between one another, between these different bases. You'd probably use something like this to maintain that easy transferability. Or you could even use it as a space weather monitoring system, which we actually proposed in the paper. We know that major events like the Carrington event that happened, can knock out all of our electromagnetic systems quite easily. A major solar flare could do that, a geomagnetic storm. But if we had the ability to detect those higher elevated activity cycles in advance, the problem is they travel obviously pretty fast, and so it's hard to get ahead of them. But you could have a station which is basically sampling solar flares very close to the surface of the Earth, and as soon as it detects anything suspicious, magnetically, it could then send that information straight back at the speed of light to your Earth and give you maybe half an hour warning or something that something bad was coming. You should shut off all your systems or get in your Faraday cage now and protect yourself. And so these quasites are kind of a cool trick of, again, kind of hacking the laws of physics. It's like another one of these exploits that the universe seems to allow us to do to potentially manifest these artificial systems that would otherwise be difficult to produce.
So leveraging natural phenomena.
Yeah. That's always the key, is to work, in my mind, it's to work with nature. That's how I see astroengineering, rather than against it. You're not trying to force it to do something. That's why I always think solar energy is so powerful, because in the battle against nuclear fusion, you're really fighting a battle where you're trying to confine plasma into this extremely tight space. Or the sun does this for free. It has gravitation, and so that's in essence what a solar panel does. It is a nuclear fusion reactor fueled energy system, but it's just using gravitation for the confinement and having a huge standoff distance for its energy collection. And so there are tricks like that. It's a very naive, simple trick in that case, where we can, rather than having to reinvent the wheel, we can use the space infrastructure, if you like, the astrophysics.
Get out of the way!
Yeah, I think in the long arc of human history, probably natural phenomena is the right solution. That's the simple, that's the elegant solution, because all the power is already there. That's why a Dyson sphere in the long sort of,
Get him!
well, you don't know what a Dyson sphere would look like, but some kind of thing that leverages the power, the energy that's already in the sun is better than creating artificial nuclear fusion reaction. But then again, that brings us to the topic of AI. How much of this,
Anna?
if we're traveling out there,
We don't have any
interstellar
tuna.
travel, or doing some of the interesting things we've been talking about,
We can
how
have
much
tuna tomorrow, Anna, when we
of
wake
those
up,
ships
alright?
would be occupied by AI systems, do you think? What would be the living organisms occupying it?
Yeah, it's depressing to think about AI.
We're gonna
in
have
the search
tuna
for life,
tomorrow, Anna.
because
It's already late.
it has. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few weeks with playing around with ChatGPT and being astonished with its capabilities. And you see that our society is undergoing a change that
Hey, I
seems
got the blue
significant
key.
in terms of the development of artificial intelligence. We've been promised this revolution, this singularity, for a long time, but it really seems to be stepping up its pace of development at this point. And so that's interesting, because as someone who looks for alien life out there in the universe, it sort of implies that our current stage of development is highly transitional, and that, you know, you go back for the last 4.5 billion years, the planet was dumb, essentially. If you go back the last few thousand years, there was a civilization, but it wasn't really producing any techno signatures. And then over the last maybe 100 years, there's been something that might be detectable from afar. But we're approaching this cusp where we might imagine it. I mean, we're thinking of like maybe years and decades with AI development, typically when we talk about this. But as an astronomer, I have to think about much longer timescales of centuries, millennia, millions of years. And so if this wave continues over that timescale, which is still the blink of an eye on a cosmic timescale, that implies that everything will be AI essentially out there, if this is a common behavior. And so that's intriguing because it sort of implies that we are special in terms of our moment in time as a civilization, which it normally is something we're averse to as astronomers. We normally like this mediocrity principle. We're not special. We're a typical part of the universe. It's sometimes called the cosmological principle. But in a temporal sense, we may be in a unique location. And perhaps that is part of a solution to the Fermi paradox, in fact, that if it is true that planets tend to go through basically 3 phases, dumb life for the vast majority, a brief period of biological intelligence, and then an extended period of artificial intelligence that they transition to, then we would be in a unique and special moment in galactic history that would be of particular interest for any anthropologists out there in the galaxy, right? This would be the time that you would want to study a civilization very carefully. You wouldn't want to interfere with it. You would just want to see how it plays out. Kind of similar to the ancestor simulations that I sometimes talked about with the simulation argument, that you are able to observe perhaps your own origins and study how the transformation happens. And so, yeah, that has for me recently been throwing the Fermi paradox a bit on its head. And this idea of the zoo hypothesis that we may be monitored, which has for a long time been sort of seen as a fringe idea, even amongst the SETI community. But if we live in this truly transitional period, it adds a lot of impetus to that idea, I think.
Well, even AI itself would, by its very nature, would be observing us. By, it's like human. There used to be this concept of human computation, which is actually exactly what's feeding the current chat language models, which is leveraging all the busy stuff we're doing to do the hard work of learning. So like the language models are trained on human interaction and human language on the internet. Mm-hmm. And so AI feeds on the output of brain power from humans. Mm. And so like it would be observing, and it gets stronger as it observes. So it actually gets extremely good at observing humans. And one of the interesting philosophical questions that starts percolating is what is the interesting thing that makes us human? We tend to think of it, and you said like there's 3 phases. What's the thing that's hard to come by in phase 3? Is it something like scarcity, which is limited resources? Is it something like consciousness? Is that the thing that's very that emerged the evolutionary process in biological systems that are operating under constrained resources? This thing that feels like something to experience the world, which we think of as consciousness, is that really
but Kaiser Permanente
is in artificial systems? Is that the thing that makes us fundamentally human, or is it just a side effect that we attribute way too much importance to? Do you have a sense? If we look out into the future, and AI systems are the ones that are traveling out there to Alpha Centauri and beyond, do you think they have to carry the flame of consciousness with them?
No, not necessarily. They may do, but it may not be necessarily. I mean, I guess we're talking about the difference here between sort of an AGI, artificial general intelligence, or consciousness, which are distinct ideas, and you can certainly have one without the other. So I could imagine.
I would disagree with this certainly in that statement.
Okay.
I think it's very possible to know
Okay. Well, I mean, to a certain degree, GPT-3 has a level of intelligence already. It's not a general intelligence, but it displays properties of intelligence with no consciousness. So
Again, I would disagree.
okay. Well, I don't know.
Because you said, very nicely, you said it displays properties of intelligence. In the same way it displays properties of intelligence, I would say it's starting to display properties of consciousness. It certainly could fool you that it's
Come at me.
conscious.
Correct. Yeah, there's I guess like a Turing test problem. If it's displaying all those properties, if it quacks like a parrot, it's like a parrot, or quacks like a duck, things like
Get him, Skittles.
isn't it basically a duck at that point?
Yes?
So yeah, I can see that argument. It
Anna,
probably,
that's enough Pringles for tonight, okay?
I mean, certainly I try to think about it from the observer's point of view as an astronomer. What am I looking for? Whether
Anna?
that intelligence is conscious or not has little
I gotta go to the
bearing,
store
I
and
think,
grab
as to
some.
what I should be looking for when I'm trying to detect evidence of them. It would maybe affect their behavior in ways that I can't predict. But that's again getting into the game of what I would call xenopsychology, of trying to make projections about the motivations of an alien species is incredibly difficult. And similarly, for any kind of artificial intelligence, it's unfathomable what its intentions may be. I mean, I would sort of question whether it would even be interested in traveling between the stars at all. If its primary goal is computation for the sake of computation, then it's probably going to have a different way of, it's going to be engineering its solar system and the nearby material around it for a different goal. If it's just simply trying to increase computer substrate across the universe. And that, of course, if that is its principal intention, to just essentially convert dumb matter into smart matter, then I think that would come into conflict with our observations of the universe, right? Because the Earth shouldn't be here if that were true. The Earth should have been transformed into computer substrate by this point. There has been plenty of time in the history of the galaxy for that to have happened. So I'm skeptical that we can. I'm skeptical in the part that that's a behavior that AI or any civilization really engages in, but I also find it difficult to find a way out of it. To explain why that would never happen in the entire history of the galaxy, amongst potentially, if life is common, millions, maybe even billions of instantiations of AI could have occurred across the galaxy. And so that seems to be a knock against the idea that there is life else or intelligent life elsewhere in the galaxy. The fact that that hasn't occurred in our history is maybe the only solid data point we really have about the activities of other civilizations.
Of course, the scary one could be that we just, at this stage, intelligent alien civilizations just start destroying themselves. It becomes too powerful. Everything's just too many weapons, too many nuclear weapons, too many nuclear weapon style systems that just, from mistake to aggression to, like, the probability of self-destruction is too high relative to the challenge of avoiding the technological challenges of avoiding self-destruction.
You mean the AI destroys itself, or
No,
we destroy ourselves prior to the advent of AI?
As we get smarter and smarter AI, either AI destroys us or there could be, like, AI is correlated, the development of AI is correlated with all sorts of technological innovation, genetic engineering, like all kinds of engineering, the nanoscale, mass manufacture, things that could destroy us, or cracking physics enough to have very powerful weapons, nuclear weapons, all of it. Just too much. Physics enables way too many things that can destroy us before it enables the propulsion systems that allow us to fly far enough away before we destroy ourselves. So maybe that's what happens to the other alien civilizations.
Is that your resolution? Because I think us in the techno-signature community and the astronomy community aren't thinking about this problem seriously enough, in my opinion. We should be thinking about what AI is doing to our society and the implications, what we're looking for. And so the only, I think, part of this thinking has to involve people like yourself who are more intimate with the machine learning and artificial intelligence world, is how do you reconcile in your mind? You said earlier that you think you can't imagine a galaxy where life and intelligence is not all over the place. And if artificial intelligence is a natural progression for civilizations, how do you reconcile that with the absence of any information around us, or any clues or hints of artificial behavior, artificially engineered stars, or colonization,
blind
computer
skulls.
substrate, transformed planets, anything like that?
It's extremely difficult for me. It's the Fermi paradox, broadly defined, is extremely difficult for me. And the terrifying thing is, one thing I suspect is that we keep destroying ourselves. The probability of self-destruction with advanced technology is just extremely high. That's why we're not seeing it. But then again, my intuition about why we haven't blown ourselves up with nuclear weapons, it's very surprising to me from a scientific perspective. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't, given all the cruelty I've seen in the world, given the power that nuclear weapons place in the hands of a very small number of individuals, it's very surprising to me we had destroy ourselves, and it seems to be a very low probability situation we have happening here. And then the other explanation is the zoo, is the observation, that we're just being observed. That's the only other thing. It's so difficult for me. Of course, all of science, everything is very humbling. It would be very humbling for me to learn that we're alone in the universe. It would change. You know what? Maybe I do want that to be true, because you want us to be special. That's why I'm resisting that thought. Maybe there's no way we're that special. There's no way we're that special. That's where my resistance comes from.
I would just say, the specialness is something we implicitly in that statement. There's kind of an assumption that we are something positive, like we're a gift to this planet or something, and that makes it special. But it may be that intelligence is more of we're like rats or cockroaches. We're an infestation of this planet. We're not some benevolent property that a planet would ideally like to have, if you can even say such a thing. But we may be not only a generally a negative force for a planet's biosphere and its own survivability, which I think you can make a strong argument about, but we may also be a very persistent infestation that may, even in, interesting thoughts, in the wake of a nuclear war, would that be an absolute eradication of every human being, which would be a fairly extreme event? Or would the candle of consciousness, as you might call it, the flame of consciousness, continue with some small pockets that would maybe in 10,000 years, 100,000 years, we'd see civilization re-emerge and play out the same thing over again?
Yeah, that's certainly, but nuclear weapons aren't powerful enough yet. But yes, but to sort of push back on the infestation, sure, but the word special doesn't have to be positive. I just mean,
I think it tends to imply, but I take your point, yeah, but maybe just maybe
unique.
Extremely rare might be.
Yeah. And that to me, it's very strange for me to be cosmically unique. It's just very strange. I mean, that we're the only thing of this level of complexity in the galaxy just seems very strange to me.
I would just, as I said, I do think it depends on this classification. I think there is sort of, again, it's kind of buried within there as a subtext, but there is a classification that we're doing here, that what we are is a distinct category of life. Let's say in this case, when we're talking about intelligence, we are something that can be separated. But of course, we see intelligence across the animal kingdom in, dolphins, humpback whales, octopuses, crows, ravens, and so it's quite possible that that these are all manifestations of the same thing, and we are not a particularly distinct class, except for the fact we make technology. That's really the only difference about intelligence, and we classify that separately. But from a biological perspective, to some degree, it's really just all part of a continuum. And so that's why when we talk about unique, you are putting yourself in a box which is distinct and saying this is the only example of things that fall into this box. but the walls of that box may themselves be a construct of our own arrogance that we are something distinct.
True. But I was also speaking broadly for us, meaning all life on Earth. But then it's possible that there's all kinds of living ecosystems on other planets and other moons that just don't have interest in technological development. Maybe technological development is the parasitic thing that destroys the organism broadly, and then maybe that's actually one of the fundamental realities. Whatever broad way to categorize technological development, that's just a parasitic thing that just destroys us all.
Yeah,
I think it's a cancer, you know.
We're flirting around. Sorry to interrupt, but we're flirting around this idea of the great filter a little bit here. So we're really asking, where is this? Does it lie ahead of us? Nuclear war, maybe imminent, that would be a filter that's ahead of us, or could it be behind us, and that it's the advent of technology that is genuinely a rare occurrence in the universe, and that explains the Fermi paradox. And so that's something that obviously people have debated and argued about in SETI for decades and decades, but it remains a persistent. People argue whether it should be really called a paradox or not, but it remains a consistent, apparent contradiction that you can make a very cogent argument as to why you expect life and intelligence to be common in the universe, and yet everything we know about the universe is fully compatible with just us being here. And that's a haunting thought, but I have no preference or desire for that to be true. I'm not trying to impose that view on anyone, but I do ask that we remain open-minded until evidence has been collected either way.
The thing is, it's one of, if not the, probably I would argue is the most important question facing human civilization, or the most interesting.
Yeah.
I think, scientifically speaking, like, what question is more important than somehow, you know, there could be other ways to sneak up to it, but it gets to the essence of what we are, what
Yes.
these living organisms are. Is somehow seeing another kind helps us understand.
It speaks to the human condition, helps us understand what it is to be human to some degree. I think, you know, I have tried to remain very agnostic about the idea of life and intelligence. One thing I try to be more optimistic about, and I've been thinking a lot with our searches for life in the universe, is life in the past. I think it's actually not that hard to imagine we are the only civilization in the galaxy right now.
living.
Yeah, that's currently extant. But there may be very many extinct civilizations. If each civilization has a typical lifetime comparable to, let's say, AI is the demise of our own, that's only a few hundred years of technological development, or maybe 10,000 years if you go back to the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of agriculture. You know, hardly anything in cosmic time span. That's nothing. That's the blink of an eye. And so it's not surprising at all that we would happen not to coexist with anyone else. But that doesn't mean nobody else was ever here. And if other civilizations come to that same conclusion and realization, maybe they scour the galaxy around them, don't find any evidence for intelligence, then they have two options. They can either give up on communication and just say, well, it's never going to happen. We just may as well just, you know, worry about what's happening here on our own planet. Or they could attempt communication, but communication through time. And that's almost the most selfless act of communication, because there's no hope of getting anything back. It's a philanthropic gift almost to that other civilization that you can maybe it might just be nothing more than a monument, which the pyramids essentially are, a monument of their existence, that these are the things they achieved, this was their, you know, the things they believed in, their language, their culture. Or it could be maybe something more than that. It could be sort of lessons from what they learned in their own history. And so I've been thinking a lot recently about how would we send a message to other civilizations in the future? Because that act of thinking seriously about the engineering of how we would design it would inform us about what we should be looking for. And also perhaps be our best chance, quite frankly, of ever making contact. It might not be the contact we dream of, but it's still contact. There would still be a record of our existence, as pitiful as it might be compared to a two-way communication.
And I love the humility behind that project, that universal project.
Yeah.
It's it's humble in it humbles you to the vast temporal landscape of the universe. Just realizing our day-to-day lives, all of us will be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to think about something that sends a signal out to other,
It's almost like a humility of acceptance as well, of knowing that you have a terminal disease, but your impact on the earth doesn't have to end with your death, that it could go on beyond with what you leave behind for others to discover with maybe the books you write or what you leave in the literature.
Do you think launching the Roadster vehicle out in space with the Permanente?
Yeah, the Roadster. I'm not sure what someone would make of that if they found it.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, there have been quasi attempts at it beyond the Roadster. I mean, there's plaques there's the Pioneer plaques, there's the Voyager 2 Golden Record. It's pretty unlikely anybody's going to discover those because they're just adrift in space, and they will eventually mechanically die. And not
They
keep
killed
them
you,
sitting
Skittles!
there on the spot. So you'd have to be extremely lucky to come across them. I've often said to my colleagues that I think the best place is the moon. The moon, unlike the Earth, has no significant weathering. How long will the Apollo descent stages, which are still southern through the surface, last for? The only real effect is micrometeorites, which are slowly like dust smashing against them, pretty much. But that's going to take millions, potentially billions of years to erode that down. And so we have an opportunity, and that's on the surface. If you put something just a few meters beneath the surface, it would have even greater protection. And so it raises the prospect of that if we wanted to send something, a significant amount of information, to a future galactic spanning civilization that maybe cracks the interstellar propulsion problem, the moon's going to be there for 5 billion years. That's a long time for somebody to come by and detect maybe a strange pattern that we draw on the sand. For them to, big arrow, big cross, look under here, and we could have a tomb of knowledge of some record of our civilization. And so I think it's, when you think like that, what that implies to us, well, okay, the galaxy is 13 billion years old, the moon is already 4 billion years old. There may be places familiar to us, nearby to us, that we should be seriously considering as places we should look for life, and intelligent life, or evidence of relics that they might leave behind for us.
So that thinking like that will help us find these relics, and it's like a beneficial cycle that happens.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
That enables the science of study better, like all searching for files and tech signatures and so on.
Yeah,
and it's inspiring. I mean, it's also inspiring in that we want to leave a legacy behind as an entire civilization, not just in the symbols, but broadly speaking.
Yeah,
that's lasting somehow.
Yeah, and I'm part of a team that's trying to repeat the Golden Record experiment. We're trying to create an open source version of the Golden Record that future spacecraft are able to download, basically put on a little hard drive that they can carry around. Get these distributed hopefully across the solar system eventually. And
is it going to be called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Or
yeah, it could be. That's a good name. We've been toying a little bit with it, but I think probably it'll just be Golden Record at this point, or Golden Record version 2 or something. But I think another benefit that I see of this activity is that it forces us as a species to ask those questions about what it is that we want another civilization to know about us. The Golden Record was kind of funny because it had photos on it, and it had photos of people eating, for instance, but it had no photos of people defecating. Mm-hmm. And so I always thought that was kind of funny, because if I was an alien, or if I was studying an alien, if I saw images of an alien, I'm not trying to be like a perv or anything, but I would want to see the full I want to understand the biology of that alien. And so we always censor what we show. And
we should show the whole actual natural process, and then also say we humans tend to censor these things. We tend to not like to walk around naked. We tend to not to talk about some of the natural biological phenomena you talk a lot about others, and actually just be very like the way you would be to a therapist.
You
Very
killed my
transparent
friend!
about the way we actually operate in
Yeah,
this world.
I mean, and Sagan had that with the Golden Record. I think he originally there's a male and a female figure depicted on the Golden Record, and the woman had her genitalia originally drawn, and there was a lot of pushback from I think a lot of Christian groups who were not happy about the idea of throwing this into space, and so eventually they had to remove that. And so it would be confusing biologically if you're trying to study xenobiology of this alien that apparently has no genitalia, or the man does, but for some reason the woman doesn't. And that's our own societal and cultural imprint happening into that information.
That's, to be fair, just even having two sexes and predators and prey, just the whole, that could be just a very unique Earth-like thing. So they might be confused about why there's like pairs of things. Like, why are you like why is there a man and a woman in general? Like they could be, I mean, they could be confused about a lot of things in general. I don't think
I don't even know which way to go.
or there's a picture. They might not need, they might have very different senses.
They only, have sound as their only way of navigating the world. It's kind of lost to send any kind of, there's been a lot of conversation about sending video and audio and video and pictures, and that's one of the things I've been a little bit resistant about. I've been thinking, well, they might not have eyes, and so if you lived in on the Europa surface, having eyes wouldn't be very useful. If you lived on a very dark planet on the tidally locked night side of an exoplanet, having eyes wouldn't be particularly useful. So it's kind of a presumption of us to think that video is a useful form of communication.
Do you hope we become a multiplanetary species? So we almost sneaking up to that, but the efforts of SpaceX, of Elon, maybe in general what your thoughts are about those efforts. You already mentioned Starship would be very interesting for astronomy, for science in general, just getting stuff out into space. But what about the longer term goal of actually colonizing, of building civilizations on other surfaces, on moons, on planets?
It seems like a fairly obvious thing to do for our survival, right? There's a high risk if we are committed to trying to keep this human experiment going. Putting all of our eggs in one basket is always going to be a risky strategy to pursue.
It's a nice basket, though. But
It is a beautiful basket. I wouldn't want to. I personally have no interest in living on the moon.
Yeah.
I would like to visit, but I would definitely not want to spend the rest of my life and die on Mars. It's a hellhole. Mars is a very, very different. I think the idea that this is going to happen in the next 10, 20 years seems to me very optimistic. Not that it's insurmountable, but the challenges are extreme to survive on a planet like Mars, which is like a dry, frozen desert with a high radiation environment. It's a challenge of a type we've never faced before. So I'm sure human ingenuity can tackle it, but I'm skeptical that we'll have thousands of people living on Mars in my lifetime. But I would relish that opportunity to maybe one day visit such a settlement and do scientific experiments on Mars or experience Mars, do astronomy from Mars, all sorts of cool stuff you could do. Sometimes you see these dreams of outer solar system exploration, and you can like fly through the clouds of Venus, or you could just do these enormous jumps on like these small moons where you can essentially jump as high as a skyscraper and traverse them. So there's all sorts of wonderful ice skating on Europa might be fun. So don't get me wrong, I love the idea of us becoming interplanetary. I think it's just a question of time. Our own destructive tendencies are, as you said earlier, are at odds with our emerging capability to become interplanetary. And the question is, will we get out of the nest before we burn it down? And I don't know. I hope that we do, but I don't have any special insight that there is a problem. There is somewhat of a gnawing intellectual itch I have with the so-called doomsday argument, which I try not to treat too seriously, but there is some element of it that bothers me. The doomsday argument basically suggests that, you're typically the mediocrity principle, you're not special, that you're probably going to be born somewhere in the middle of all human beings who will ever be born. You're unlikely to be one of the first 1% of human beings that ever lived, and one of the last 1%, and similarly the last 1% of human beings that will ever live. Because you'd be very unique and special if that were true. And so by this logic, you can sort of calculate how many generations of humans you might expect. So if there's been, let's say, 100 billion human beings that have ever lived on this planet, then you could say to 95% confidence, so you divide by 5%, so 100 billion divided by 0.05 would give you 2 trillion human beings that would ever live, you'd expect by this argument. And so if let's say each planet, in general the planet has a 10 billion population, so that would be 200 generations of humans we would expect ahead of us. And if each one has an average lifetime of say 100 years, then that would be about 20,000 years. So there's 20,000 years left in the clock. There's like a typical doomsday argument type. That's how they typically lay it out. Now you can argue a lot of the criticisms of the doomsday argument come down to, well, what are you really counting? You're counting humans there, but maybe you should be counting years, or maybe you should be counting human hours. What are you? Because what you count makes a big difference to what you get out on the other end. So this is called the reference class. And so that's one of the big criticisms of the doomsday argument. But I do think it has a compelling point that it would be surprising if our future is to one day blossom and become a galactic spanning empire. Trillions upon trillions upon trillions of human beings will one day live across the stars for essentially as long as the galaxy exists and the stars burn. We would live at an incredibly special point in that story. We would be right at the very, very, very beginning. And that's not impossible, but it's just somewhat improbable. And so there's part of that sort of irks against me, but it also almost feels like a philosophical argument because you're sort of talking about souls being drawn from this cosmic pool. So it's not an argument that I lose sleep about for our fate of the doomsday, but it is somewhat intellectually annoying that there is a slight contradiction there, it feels like, with the idea of a galactic spanning empire.
Yeah, but of course there's so many unknowns.
Okay, I think I need to go.
I for one would love to visit even space, but Mars. Just imagine standing on Mars and looking back at Earth.
Yeah.
I mean,
the incredible sight. It would give you such a fresh perspective as to your entire existence and what it meant to be human.
Yeah, and then come back to Earth, and it would give you a heck of a perspective. Plus, the sunset on Mars is supposed to be nice.
I loved what William Shatner said after his flight. His words really moved me when he came down, and I think it really captured the idea that we shouldn't really be sending engineers, our scientists into space. We should be sending out poets, because those are the people when they come down who can truly make a difference when they describe their experiences in space. And I found it very moving reading what he said.
Yeah, when you talk to astronauts, when they describe what they see, it's like this, like they discovered a whole new thing that they can't possibly convert back into words.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful to see. Just as a quick, before I forget, I have to ask you, can you summarize your argument against the hypothesis that we live in a simulation? Is it similar to our discussion about the doomsday clock?
No, it's actually probably more similar to my agnosticism about life in the universe, and it's just sort of remaining agnostic about all possibilities. The simulation argument, sometimes it gets mixed. There's kind of two distinct things that we need to consider. One is the probability that we live in so-called base reality, that we're not living in a simulated reality itself. And another probability we need to consider is the probability that technology is viable, possible, and something we will ultimately choose to one day do. And those are two distinct things. They're probably quite similar numbers to each other, but they are distinct probabilities. So in my paper I wrote about this, I just tried to work through the problem. I teach astrophysics, actually teaching it this morning. And so it just seemed like a fun case study of working through a Bayesian calculation for it. Bayesian calculations work on conditionals. And so when you hear, what kind of inspired this project was when I heard Musk said was like a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance that we don't live in a simulation. He's right if you add the Bayesian conditional, and the Bayesian conditional is conditioned upon the fact that we eventually develop that technology and choose to use it, or it's chosen to be used by such species, by such civilizations. That's the conditional. And you have to add that in because that conditional isn't guaranteed. And so in a Bayesian framework, you can kind of make that explicit. You see mathematically, explicitly, that's a conditional in your equation. On the opposite side of the coin is basically in the trilemma that Bostrom originally put forward, it's options 1 and 2. So option 1 is that you basically never develop the ability to do that. Option 2 is you never choose to execute that. So we kind of group those together as sort of the non-simulation scenario, let's call it. And so you've got non-simulation scenario and simulation scenario. And agnostically, we really have to give how do you assess the a priori model probability of those two scenarios? It's very difficult, and I think people would probably argue about how you assign those priors. In the paper, we just assigned 50-50. We just said, this hasn't been demonstrated yet. There's no evidence that this is actually technically possible, but nor is it that it's not technically possible. So we're just going to assign 50-50 probability to these two hypotheses. And then in the hypothesis where you have a simulated reality, you have a base reality set at the top. So there is, even in the simulated hypothesis, there's a probability you still live in base reality. And then there's a whole myriad of universes beneath that which are all simulated. And so you have a very slim probability of being in base reality if this is true. And you have a 100% probability of living in base reality, on the other hand, if it's not true and we never develop that ability or choose never to use it. And so then you apply this technique called Bayesian model averaging, which is where you propagate the uncertainty of your two models to get a final estimate. And because of that one base reality that lives in the simulated scenario, you end up counting this up and getting that it always has to be less than 50%. So the probability you live in a simulated reality versus base reality has to be slightly less than 50%. Now that really comes down to that statement of giving it 50-50 odds to begin with. And on the one hand, you might say, look, David, I work in artificial intelligence. I'm very confident that this is going to happen, just off extrapolating off current trends. Or on the other hand, a statistician would say, you're giving way too much weight to the simulation hypothesis because it's an intrinsically highly complicated model. You have a whole hierarchy of realities within realities within realities. It's like the Inception style thing, right? And so this requires hundreds, thousands, millions of parameterizations to describe. And by Occam's razor, we would always normally penalize inherently complicated models as being disfavored. So I think you could argue I'm being too generous or too kind with that, but I sort of want to develop the rigorous mathematical tools to explore it. And ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you think that 50-50 odds should be. But you can use my formula to plug in whatever you want and get the answer, and I use 50-50.
So, but when in that first pile, with the first two parts of the Bostrom talks about, it seems like connected to that is the question we've been talking about, which is the number of times at bat you get, which is the number of intelligent civilizations that are out there that can build such simulations. It seems like very closely connected, because if we're the only ones that are here that can build such things, that changes things.
Yeah. I mean, the simulation hypothesis has all sorts of implications like that. I've always loved, Sean Carroll pointed out a really interesting contradiction apparently with the simulation hypothesis that I speak about a little bit in the paper. But he showed that, or pointed out that in this hierarchy of realities, which then develop their own AIs within the realities, and then they, or really ancestor simulations, I should say, rather than AI, they develop their own capability to simulate realities. You get this hierarchy, and so eventually there'll be a bottom layer, which I often call the sewer of reality. It's like the worst layer where it's the most pixelated it could possibly be, right? So, because each layer is necessarily going to have less computational power than the layer above it. Because not only are you simulating that entire planet, but also some of that's being used for the computers themselves, that those are simulated. And so that base reality, also the sewer reality, is a reality where they are simply unable to produce ancestor simulations because the fidelity of the simulation is not sufficient. And so from their point of view, it might not be obvious that the universe is pixelated, but they would just never be able to manifest that capability.
What if they're constantly simulating? Because in order to appreciate the limits of the fidelity, you have to have an observer. What if they're always simulating a dumber and dumber observer?
Yeah.
What if the sewer has very dumb observers that can't, like scientists, they're the dumbest possible scientists. So like it's very pixelated, but the scientists are too dumb to even see the pixelations.
Right.
So like that's like built into the universe always has to be a limitation on the cognitive capabilities of the complex systems that are within it.
Yeah, so that sewer reality, they would still presumably be able to have a very impressive computational capabilities. They'd probably be able to simulate galactic formation, all this kind of impressive stuff, but they would be just short of the ability to, however you define it, create a truly sentient conscious experience in a computer. That would just be beyond their capabilities. And so Carol pointed out that if you add up all the, you count up how many realities there should be, probabilistically, if this is true, over here, the simulation hypothesis or scenario, then you're most likely to find yourself in the sewer because there's just far more of them than there are of any of the higher levels.
Oh.
And so that sort of sets up a contradiction because then you live in a reality which is inherently incapable of ever producing ancestor simulations. But the premise of the entire argument is that ancestor simulations are possible. So there's a contradiction that's been introduced.
There's that old quote, we're all living in the sewer, but some of us are looking up at the stars.
This is maybe more true than we think.
But to me, so there's of course physics and computational fascinating questions here, but to me there's a practical psychological question, which is, how do you create a virtual reality world that is as compelling and not necessarily even as realistic, but almost as realistic, but as compelling or more compelling than physical reality. Because something tells me it's not very difficult in the
Hey, I got
full
that
history of
yellow
human
smoke.
civilization. That is an
Is that how this
interesting
works?
kind of simulation to me.
It
Because
is how
that
it
feels
works.
like it's doable in the next 100 years. Creating a world where we're all prefer
now.
to live in the digital world. And not like a visit, but like it's
Come on, Skittles.
like you're seen as insane. No, like you're required. It's unsafe to live outside of the virtual world. And it's interesting to me from an engineering perspective how to build that, because I'm somebody that sort of loves video games, and it seems like you can create incredible worlds and stay there. And it's a different question than creating a ultra high resolution, high fidelity simulation of physics. But if that world inside a video game is as consistent as the physics of our reality, you can have your own scientists in that world that trying to understand that physics world. It might look different.
And presumably they'd
that's what I'm
eventually
doing.
forget, give it long enough, they might forget about their origins of being once biological and assume this was their only reality.
Especially if you're now born, well, certainly if you're born, but even if you were 8 years old or something when you first started wearing the headset.
Yeah, or you have a memory wipe when you go in. I mean, it also kind of maybe speaks to this issue of like Neuralink and how do we keep up with AI in our world. If you want to augment your intelligence, perhaps one way of competing, and one of your impetuses for going into this digital reality would be to be competitive intellectually with artificial intelligences, that you could trivially augment your reality if your brain was itself artificial. But I mean, one skepticism I've always had about that is whether it's more of a philosophical question, but how much is that really you? Can you do a mind upload? Is this just a duplicate of your memories that thinks it's you versus truly a transference of your conscious stream into that reality? And I think when it's almost like the teleportation device in Star Trek, but with teleportation, quantum teleportation, you can kind of rigorously show that as long as all of the quantum numbers are exactly duplicated as you transfer over, it truly is, from the universe's perspective, in every way indistinguishable from what was there before. It really is, in principle, you and all the sense of being you, versus creating a duplicate clone and uploading memories to that human body or a computer that would surely be a discontinuation of that conscious experience by virtue of the fact you've multiplied it. And so I would be hesitant about uploading for that reason. I would see it mostly as my own killing myself and having some AI duplicate of me that persists in this world, but is not truly my experience.
Typical 20th century human with an attachment to this particular singular instantiation of brain and body. How silly humans used to be. Used to have rotary phones and and other silly things. You're an incredible human being. You're an educator. You're a researcher. You have like an amazing YouTube channel. Looking to young people, if you were to give them advice, how can they have a career that maybe is inspired by yours, inspired by wandering curiosity, a career they can be proud of, or a life they can be proud of? What advice would you give?
I certainly think in terms of a career in science, one thing that I maybe discovered late but has been incredibly influential on me in terms of my own happiness and my own productivity has been this synergy of doing two passions at once. One passion in science communication, another passion in research, and not surrendering either one. And I think that tends to be seen as something that's an either or. You have to completely dedicate yourself to one thing to gain mastery in it. That's a conventional way of thinking about both science and other disciplines. And I have found that both have been elevated by practicing in each. And I think that's true in all aspects of life. I mean, if you want to become the best researcher you possibly can, you're pushing your intellect and in a sense your body to a high level. And so to me, I've always wanted to couple that with training of my body, training of my mind in other ways besides from just what I'm doing when I'm in the lecture room or when I'm in my office, calculating something. Focusing on your own development through whatever it is, meditation. For me, it's often running, working out, and pursuing multiple passions provides this almost synergistic bliss of all of them together. So often I've had some of the best research ideas from making a YouTube video and trying to communicate an idea or interacting with my audience who've had a question that sparked a whole trail of thought that led down this wonderful intellectual rabbit hole, or maybe to a new intellectual discovery. Can go either way sometimes with those things. And so thinking broadly, diversely, and always looking after yourself in this highly competitive and often extremely stressful world that we live in, is the best advice I can offer anybody. And just try, if you can, it's very cheesy, but if you can follow your passions, you'll always be happy. Trying to sell out for the quick cash out, for the quick buck out, can be tempting in the short term. Looking for exomoons was never easy, but I made a career not out of discovering exomoons, but out of learning how to communicate the difficult problem and discovering all sorts of things along the way. We shot for the sky and we discovered all this stuff along the way. We discovered dozens of new planets using all sorts of new techniques. We pushed this instrumentation to new places, and I've had an extremely productive research career in this world. I've had all sorts of ideas working on techno signatures. It's thinking innovatively pushes you into all sorts of exciting directions. So just try to, it's hard to find that passion, but you can sometimes remember it when you were a kid, what your passions were and what fascinated you as a child. For me, as soon as I picked up a space boat when I was 5 years old, that was it. I was hooked on space, and I almost betrayed my passion at college. I studied physics, which I've always been fascinated by physics as well. But I came back to astronomy because it was my first love, and I was much happier doing
That's too
research
bad.
in astronomy than I was in physics, because it spoke to that wonder I had as a child that first was the spark of curiosity for me in science.
So society will try to get you to look at hot Jupiters,
Yeah.
and the advice is to look for the cool world instead. What do you think is the meaning of this whole thing? You ever ask yourself why?
It's just a ride. That's how I think. It's just a ride. We're on a roller coaster, and we have no purpose. It's an accident in my perspective. There's no meaning to my life. There's no objective deity who is overwatching what I'm doing, and I have some fate or destiny. It's all just riding on a roller coaster and trying to have a good time and contribute to other people's enjoyment of the ride.
Yeah, try to make it a happy accident.
Yeah. I see no fundamental providence in my life or in the nature of the universe, and you just see this universe as this beautiful cosmic accident of galaxies smashing together, stars forging here and there, and planets occasionally spawning maybe life across the universe. And we are just one of those instantiations, and we should just enjoy this very brief episode that we have. And I think trying to look at it much deeper than that is to me is not very soul satisfying. I just think enjoy what you've got and appreciate it.
It does seem noticing that beauty helps make the ride pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
David, you're an incredible person. I haven't covered most of the things I wanted to talk to you about. This was an incredible conversation. I'm glad you exist. I'm glad you're doing everything you're doing, and I'm a huge fan. Thank you so much for talking today. This was amazing.
Thank you so much, Lex. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with David Kipping. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from Carl Sagan. Perhaps the aliens are here, but are hiding because of some Lex Galactica, some ethic of non-interference with emerging civilizations. We can imagine them, curious and dispassionate, observing us, as we would watch a bacterial culture in a dish, to determine whether this year, again, we manage to avoid self-destruction. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
Decade, the commercial sector took over this, this industry that traditionally has really been like a government thing to do.
Motivated primarily by the competition between nations, like the Cold War.
Sure.
And now it's motivated more and more by the natural forces of capitalism.
Yes, that's right. So, okay, here I have many ideas about it. I think on the one hand, right, like what SpaceX has been able to do, for example, phenomenal. If that brings down the price of space exploration, that turnaround timescale for space exploration, which I think it inevitably will, that's a huge boost to the same time, right? If we're talking astronomy, right, they're also, it comes at a huge cost, right? And the Starlink satellites is a great example of that cost, right? At one point, in fact, I was just camping in the Mojave with a friend of mine, and they saw, this string of satellites just kind of like, appear and then disappear into nowhere. So that is beginning to interfere with, Earth-based observation. So I think there's tremendous potential there. It's also important to be responsible about how it's executed. Now, with Mars and the whole idea of exploring Mars, right, I don't have like strong opinions on whether a manned mission is required or not
Thanks a lot,
required.
Skittles.
But I do think, we need to the thing to keep in mind is that I generally kind of I'm not signed on, if you will, to the idea that Mars is some kind of a safe haven that we can, escape to, right? Mars sucks, right? Like living on Mars. If you want to live on Mars, like you can have that experience by going to the Mojave Desert and camping, and it's just like. It's just not a great.
Well, it's interesting, but there's something captivating about that kind of mission of us striving out into space, and by making Mars in some ways habitable for at least like months at a time, I think would lead to engineering breakthroughs that would make life like in many ways much better on Earth. Like we'll come up with ideas we totally don't expect yet, both on the robotics side, on the food engineering side, on the maybe like we'll switch from we'll like there'll be huge breakthroughs in insect farming, as exciting as I find that idea to be. That in in the ways we consume protein, maybe it'll revolutionize. We do factory farming, which is full of cruelty and and torture of animals. Will revolutionize that completely because of our we shouldn't need to go to Mars to revolutionize life here on Earth, but at the same time I shouldn't need a deadline to get shit done, but I do need it. And then in the same way, I think we need Mars. There's something about the human spirit that loves that longing for
I agree with that thesis. The going to the moon, right, and that whole endeavor has captivated the imagination of so many, and it has led to incredible ideas, really, and probably in non-linear ways, right? Not like, okay, we went to the moon, therefore some person here has thought of this. And
yes.
In that similar sense, I think space exploration there's some real magnetism about it, and it's on a genetic level, right? Like we have this need to keep exploring, right? When we're done with a certain frontier, we move on to the next frontier. All that I'm saying is that I'm not moving to Mars to live there permanently ever, and I think that I'm glad you noted the kind of degradation of the Earth, right? I think that is a true kind of the leading order challenge of our time.
Yeah, it's a great engineering.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a bunch of engineering problems. I'm most interested in space because, as I've read extensively, it's apparently very difficult to have sex in space, and so I just want that problem to be solved, because I think once we solve the sex in space problem, we'll revolutionize sex here on Earth, thereby increasing the fun on Earth, and the consequences of that can only be good.
I mean, you've got a clear plan. Yeah. Right, and it sounds like
I'm submitting proposals to NASA as we speak.
That's right.
I keep getting rejected. I don't know why. Okay.
You need better diagrams.
better pictures. I should have thought of that. You a while ago mentioned that there's certain aspects in the history of the solar system and Earth that it could have resulted in an opaque atmosphere, but it didn't. We can see the stars. And somebody mentioned to me a little bit ago, it's almost like a philosophical question for you. Do you think human society would develop as it did, or at all, if we couldn't see the stars?
It would be drastically different. If it ever did develop. So I think some of the early developments, right, of like
fire and
fire. First of all, that atmosphere would be so hot because if you have an opaque atmosphere, the temperature at the bottom is huge. So we would be very different beings to start with. We'd have
but it
very
could
different.
Be cloudy in certain kinds of ways that you could still get.
Okay, think about like a greenhouse, right? A greenhouse is cloudy effectively, but it's super hot. It's hard to avoid having an atmosphere. If you have an opaque atmosphere, it's hard to, right? Venus is a great example, right? Venus is, I don't remember exactly how many degrees, but it's hundreds in Celsius, right? It's not 100, it's hundreds. Even though it's only a little bit closer to the sun, that temperature is entirely coming from the fact that the atmosphere is thick.
So it's a sauna of sorts.
Yeah, you go there, You feel refreshed after you come back, you know.
But if you stay there, I mean, okay, take that as an assumption. This is a philosophical question, not a biological one. So you have a life that develops under these extremely hot conditions.
Yeah, so let's see. So much of the early evolution of mankind was driven by exploration.
Yeah.
Right? And the kind of interest in stars originated in part as a tool to guide that exploration. Right? I mean, that in itself, I think would be a huge, a huge differential in the way that we, our evolution on this planet.
Yeah, I mean, stars, that's brilliant. So even in that aspect, but even in further aspects, astronomy just shows up in basically every single development in the history of science up until the 20th century. It shows up. So I wonder, without that, if we would even get like calculus.
Yeah, look, that's a great point. Newton in part developed calculus because he was interested in explaining Kepler's laws, right? In general, that whole mechanistic understanding of the night sky, right, replacing a religious understanding where you interpret, this is, this whatever fire god riding his, little chariot across the sky, as opposed to, this is some mechanistic set of laws, that transformed humanity and arguably put us on the course that we're on today, right? The entirety of the last 400 years and the development of kind of our technological world that we live in today was sparked by that, right? Abandoning an effectively, a non-secular view of the natural world and kind of saying, okay, this can be understood, and if it can be understood, it can be utilized. We can create our own variants of this. Absolutely, we would be a very, very different species without astronomy. This, I think, extends beyond just astronomy, right? There are questions like, why do we need to spend money on X, right? Where X can be anything, like paleontology, right?
The mating patterns of penguins.
Yeah, that's like
essential.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a tremendous underappreciation for the usefulness of useless knowledge. Right? I mean,
that's brilliant.
I didn't come up with this. This is a little book by the guy who started the Institute for Advanced Studies. But it's so true. So much of the electronics that are on this table, right, work on Maxwell's equations. Maxwell wasn't sitting around in the 1800s saying, I hope one day, we'll make, a couple mics so, a couple guys can, have this conversation, right? Yeah. That wasn't at no point was that the motivation, and yet, it gave us the world that we have today. And the answer is, if you are a purely pragmatic person, if you don't care at all about kind of the human condition, none of this, the answer is you can tax it, right? Like useless things have created way more capital than useful things.
And the sad thing, I mean, first of all, it's really important to think about, and it's brilliant in the following context. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson has this book about the role of military-based funding in the development of science, and then so much of technological breakthroughs in the 20th century had to do with humans working on different military things. And then the outcome of that had nothing to do with military. It had some military application, but their impact was much, much bigger than military.
The splitting of the atom is a kind of a canonical example of this. We all know the tragedy that arises from splitting of the atom, and yet so much. I mean, the atom itself does not care for what purpose it is being split. So
I wonder if we took the same amount of funding as we used for war and poured it into like totally seeming
Okay. Okay. Sweet. Alright, let's do this.
Fuck Chris Kringle and fuck Chris the presence. Santa's a bitch, the real gift is my presence. I build tension like dominant sevens. Sentence resolve the suspension like gaps in the pheasant. You what you space stuttering Professor Quirrell. I get tag team head from your mom's young girl. I blast in the faces like my innuendo. A defense against the dark arts, yeah, Nintendo. Your woman drinks up my nutties. You're bringing the pinata, fucking all of my buddies. Sour shan't stop none all over the place. Get my stunted slime off your mom's face. Eat fast, drive fast, all the way to the Pentagon. Sunglasses on, a penis big as a megalodon. License to fuck, bully that nerd James Bond. Facing Skittles undercover, making all the ladies moms. The sound of thunder, I'm clapping that ass. Electrostatic discharge and natural gas. Generating ozone and fat stacks of cash. Hidden camera POV, no shutter, no flash. I dropped the phone on her head as she's working the car. So dumb she believed that I was going for pink sock. Getting bored now, flip her around onto her knees. Make her let my people go with a holler Ramses. You'd have to cut her belly open if you ever hope to find even a shred of physical evidence that I may have left behind. I plugged her nose as I was coming, poked her eyes so she'd be blind. Never said she wouldn't swallow, but I don't fucking read minds. My balls are heavy as your fat ass mom's purse. My dick past the levy that taxes the church. Send me the power level
All
talk
right, you guys.
because I'm getting ready to flex,
been
and
great.
I ought to know
I'll
how
see you in
much
a
room
couple
I have to
minutes.
stretch.